Her was deception. Every Aes Sedai hid behind various masks over time. It became habit after a while. I believe the situation in Tyr may be resolved peacefully yet, she said, peering into the fire. She might have been talking to herself, or wanted Cadsuane to think it. Herna and Siman are growing quite desperate, afraid the other High Lords will return from Ilion and trap them in the city. They may be amenable to accepting Darlin, given their other choices. Estanda is made of sterner stuff, but if she can be convinced there's advantage for her in it. I told you not to go near them, Cadsuane broke in sternly. The stout woman blinked at her in surprise. I didn't. The streets are always full of rumors, and I do know how to piece rumors together and sift out the little truth. I did see Alana and Raphella, but I ducked behind a fellow hawking meat pies from a barrow before they saw me. I'm sure they didn't. She paused, clearly waiting for Cadsuane to explain why she had been told to avoid the sisters as well. I have to go to the boy now, Varen, Cadsuane said instead. That was the trouble with agreeing to advise someone. Even when you managed to set all the conditions you could wish for, most of them anyway, you still had to come sooner or later when they called, eventually. But it did give her a reason to evade Varen's curiosity. The answer was simple. If you tried to solve every problem yourself, you ended by solving none. And with some problems, how they were solved really did not matter in the long run. But not answering left Varen with a puzzle to ponder, a little butter for her paws. When Cadsuane was unsure of someone, she wanted them unsure of her, too. Varen gathered up her cloak and left the room with her. Did the other woman mean to accompany her? But outside the sitting room, they encountered Nasuna walking briskly down the hall. She came to a sudden halt. No more than a handful of people had ever managed to ignore Cadsuane, yet Nasuna did a credible job, her nearly black eyes latching on to Varen. You're back, then, are you? The best of Browns did have a way of stating the obvious. You wrote a paper on animals of the drowned lands, as I recall, which meant that Varen had. Nasuna recalled everything she had ever seen, a useful skill, if Cadsuane had been sure enough of her to make use of it. Lord Algaran showed me the skin of a large snake he claims came from the drowned lands, but I'm convinced it is the same as I observed. Varen glanced helplessly at Cadsuane over her shoulder as the taller woman drew her away by her sleeve, but before they were 3 steps along the corridor, she was deep in discussion over this fool snake. It was a remarkable sight, and troubling in a way. Nasuna was loyal to Elida, or had been, while Varen was one of those who wanted to pull Elida down, or had been. Now they talked amiably about snakes.
Yeah, he had a good day.
That both had sworn fealty to the Althor boy could be laid to his being Taviran, winding the pattern around himself unconsciously. But was that oath sufficient to make them ignore their opposition over who held the Amerlin seat? Or were they affected by having a Taviran in close proximity? She would have liked very much to know that. None of her ornaments protected against Taviran. Of course, she did not know what 2 of the fish and 1 of the moons did, but it seemed unlikely they did that. It could have been as simple as Varen and Nasuna both being brown. Browns could forget everything else when they settled to study something. Snakes. Faugh. The small ornaments swayed as she shook her head before turning away, leaving the 2 receding Browns behind. What did the boy want? She had never liked being an advisor, necessary or not. Drafts along the corridors rippled the few tapestries on the walls, all in old styles and showing the wear of having been taken down and rehung many times. The manor house had grown like a rambling farmhouse rather than being built large, with additions added whenever the family's fortunes and numbers waxed. House Pendalone had never been wealthy, but there had been times they were numerous. The results showed in more than worn, old-fashioned wall hangings. The cornices were brightly painted, red or blue or yellow, but the hallways varied in width and height, and sometimes met at a slight skew. Windows that once had looked to the fields now looked down on courtyards, usually bare except for a few benches, and placed purely to provide light. Sometimes there was no choice in getting from here to there except to take a roofed colonnade overlooking one of those courtyards. The columns were wooden more often than not, though bravely painted, even where not carved. On one of those walkways, with fat green columns, two sisters were standing together watching the activity in the courtyard below. At least they were watching together when Cadsuane opened the door to the colonnade. Beldain saw her step out and stiffened, twitching at the green-fringed shawl she had worn fewer than 5 years. Pretty, with her high cheekbones and a slight tilt to her brown eyes, she had not yet achieved agelessness, and looked younger than Min, particularly when she shot Cadsuane a frosty stare and hurried from the colonnade in the other direction. Maurice, her companion, smiled after her in amusement, shifting her own green-fringed shawl slightly. Tall and usually quite serious, with her hair drawn back tightly from her pale face, Maurice was not a woman who smiled often. Beldain, she is becoming concerned that she has no warder yet, she said in the accents of Tarabon as Cadsuane stopped beside her, though her blue eyes returned to the courtyard. She seems to be considering an Ashaman if she can find one. I told her to talk to Daigyan. If it does not help her, it will help Daigyan. All of the warders they had with them were gathered in the stone-paved yard, in their shirt sleeves despite the cold, most seated on painted wooden benches watching two of their number work with wooden practice swords. Jahar, one of Maurice's 3, was a pretty sun-dark young man. The silver bells fastened to the ends of his 2 long braids chimed with the fury of his attack. He moved like a striking black-lance. Not a breath of breeze stirred, but the 8-pointed star, like a golden compass rose, seemed to shift against Cadsuane's hair. Had it been held in her hand, she could have felt it vibrating clearly. But then she already knew that Jahar was an Ashaman, and the star would not have pointed him out, merely told her that a man who could channel was nearby. The more men who could channel, the harder the star quivered, she had learned. Jahar's opponent, a very tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a stone face and a braided leather cord around his graying temples to hold back shoulder-length hair, was not the second Ashaman down there, but he was as deadly in his own way. Lan did not really seem to move that fast, but he flowed. His blade of bundled laths was always there to deflect Jahar's, always moving the younger man just a touch more out of his line. Suddenly, Lan's wooden blade struck Jahar's side with a resounding crack, a killing blow given with steel. While the younger man was still flinching from the force of the strike, Lan flowed back into a ready stance, long blade upright in his hands.
That's crazy.
Nethan, another of Maurice's, rose to his feet, a lean fellow with wings of white at his temples and tall, if still a hand or more shorter than Lan. Jahar waved him away and raised his practice blade again, loudly demanding another go. Is Daigyan still bearing up? Cadsuane asked. Better than I expected, Maurice admitted. She stays in her room too much, but she keeps her weeping private. Her gaze shifted from the men dancing their swords to a green-painted bench, where Varen's stocky, gray-haired Tomas sat next to a grizzled fellow with only a fringe of white hair remaining. Dahmer, he wanted to try his healing on her, but Daigyan refused. She may never have had a warder before, but she knows that the grieving over a dead warder is part of remembering him. I am surprised that Coril would consider allowing it. With a shake of her head, the Taraboner's sister returned to studying Jahar. Other sisters' warders did not really interest her, at least not like her own. Ashaman, they grieve as warders do. I thought perhaps Jahar and Dahmer merely followed the lead of the others, but Jahar, he says it is their way too. I did not intrude, of course, but I watched them drink in memory of Daigyan's young Eben. They never mentioned his name, but they had a full wine cup sitting for him. Basana and Nathan, they know they can die on any day. and they accept that. Jahar expects to die. Every day he expects it. To him, every hour is most assuredly his last. Catswain barely refrained from glancing at the other woman. Maurice did not often go on at such length. The other woman's face was smooth, her manner unruffled, but something had upset her. "I know you practice linking with him," she said delicately, peering down into the courtyard. Delicacy was required in talking to another sister about her warder. That was part of the reason she stared into the courtyard, frowning. "Have you decided yet whether the Althor boys succeeded at Shadar Logoth? Did he really manage to cleanse the male half of the source?" Coriel practiced linking with Dahmer, too, but the Yellow was so focused on her futile efforts to reason out how to do with Saidar what he did with Saidin that she would not have noticed the Dark One's taint sliding down her throat. A pity she herself had not come to the shawl 50 years later than she had, or she would have bonded one of the men herself and had no need to ask. But 50 years would have meant that Norla died in her little house in the Black Hills before Cadswain Malydran ever went to the White Tower. That would have altered a great deal of history. For one thing, it would have been unlikely that she would be in anything approaching her present circumstances. So she asked, delicately, and waited. Maurice was quiet and still for a long moment, and then she sighed. "I do not know, Catswain. Saidar is a calm ocean that will take you wherever you want, so long as you know the currents and let them carry you. Saidin, an avalanche of burning stone, collapsing mountains of ice. It feels cleaner than when I first linked with Jahar, but anything could hide in that chaos. Anything." Cadswain nodded. She was not sure she had expected any other answer. Why should she find any certainty about one of the two most important questions in the world, when she could find none on so many simpler matters? In the courtyard, Lan's wooden blade stopped, not with a crack this time, just touching Jahar's throat, and the bigger man flowed back to his waiting stance. Nethan stood again, and again Jahar waved him back, angrily raising his sword and setting himself. Maurice's third, Vasana, a short, wide fellow, nearly as sun-dark as Jahar, for all he was Kyrianan, laughed and made a rude comment about over-ambitious men tripping on their own blades. Tomas and Dahmer exchanged glances and shook their heads. Men of that age usually had given up taunting long ago. The clack of wood on wood began once more. The other 4 warders were not the only audience for Lan and Jahar in the courtyard. The slim girl with her dark hair in a long braid, watching anxiously from a red bench, was the focus of Cadswain's frown. The child would need to flash her great serpent ring under people's noses to be taken for Aes Sedai, which she was, if just technically. It was not only because Nynaeve's face was a girl's face. Beldain still seemed as young. Nynaeve bounced on the bench, always on the point of leaping up. Occasionally her mouth moved as if she were silently shouting encouragement, and sometimes her hands twisted as though demonstrating how Lan should have moved his sword. A frivolous girl, full of passions, who only rarely demonstrated that she had a brain. Min was not the only one to have thrown her heart and head both down the well over a man. By the customs of dead Malkir, the red dot painted on Nynaeve's forehead indicated her marriage to Lan, though Yellows seldom married their warders. Very few sisters did, for that matter. And of course Lan was not Nynaeve's warder, however much he and the girl pretended otherwise. Who he did belong to was a matter they evaded like thieves, slipping through the night. More interesting, more disturbing, was the jewelry Nynaeve wore. A long gold necklace and slim gold belt with matching bracelets and finger rings, the gaudy red and green and blue gems that studded them clashing with her yellow-slashed dress. And she wore that peculiar piece as well on her left hand, golden rings attached to a golden bracelet by flat chains. That was an angreal, much stronger than Cadswain's shrike hair ornament. The others were much like her own decorations, too, terangreal and plainly made at the same time during the breaking of the world, when an Aes Sedai might find many hands turned against her, most especially those of men who could channel. Strange to think that they had been called Aes Sedai, too. It would be like meeting a man called Cadsuane. The question. Her morning seemed filled with questions, and the sun not halfway to noon yet. The question was, did the girl wear her jewelry because of the Althor boy? Or the Ashaman? Or because of Cadsuane Malydrin? Nynaeve had demonstrated her loyalty to a young man from her own village, and she had shown her wariness of him as well. She did have a brain when she chose to use it. Until that question was answered, however, trusting the girl too far was dangerous. The trouble was, little these days did not seem dangerous. Jahar is growing stronger, Maurice said abruptly. For an instant, Cadsuane frowned at the other green. Stronger? The young man's shirt was beginning to cling damply to his back, while Lan appeared not to have broken his first sweat. Then she understood. Maurice meant in the power. Cadsuane only raised a questioning eyebrow, though. She could not recall the last time she had let shock reach her face. It might have been all those years ago in the Black Hills when she began earning the ornaments she now wore. At first, I thought the way these Ashaman train, the forcing, had pushed him to his full strength already, Maurice said, frowning down at the two men working their practice blades. No, it was at Jahar she was frowning. Just a faint crinkle of her eyes, but she reserved her frowns for those who could see and know her displeasure. At Shadar Logos, I thought. I must be imagining it. 3 or 4 days ago, I was half convinced I was mistaken. Now, I am sure I am correct. If men gain strength by fits and starts, there is no saying how strong he will become. She did not voice her obvious worry, of course, that he might grow stronger than she. Saying such a thing would have been unthinkable on many different levels, and while Maurice had become somewhat accustomed to doing the unthinkable, most sisters would faint at the very idea of bonding a man who could channel. She was never comfortable giving them voice. Cadsuane was, yet she kept her voice neutral. Light, but she hated being delicate. Hated the necessity, anyway. He seems content, Maurice. Maurice's warders always seemed content. She handled them well. He is in a fury of... The other woman touched the side of her head, as though fingering the bundle of sensations she felt through the bond. She really was upset. Not rage, frustration. Reaching into her green worked leather belt pouch, she took out a small enameled pin, a sinuous figure in red and gold, like a snake with legs and a lion's mane. I do not know where the Althor lad got this, but he gave it to Jahar. Apparently for Ashaman, it is akin to attaining the shawl. I had to take it away, of course. Jahar, he is still at the stage where he has to learn to accept only what I say he can. But he is so agitated over the thing. Should I give it back to him? In a way, it would come from my hand then. Cadsuane's eyebrows began to climb before she could control them. Maurice was asking advice about one of her warders? Of course, Cadsuane had suggested she sound the man out in the first place, but this degree of intimacy was unthinkable. Faugh. I'm sure whatever you decide will be correct. With one last glance at Nynaeve, she left the taller woman stroking the enameled pin with her thumb and frowning down into the courtyard. Lan had just defeated Jahar once more, but the young man was squaring up again, demanding yet another match. Whatever Maurice decided, she had already learned one thing she did not like. The boundaries between Aes Sedai and warders had always been as clear as the connections. Aes Sedai commanded and warders obeyed. But if Maurice, of all people, was dithering over a collar pin, Maurice, who managed her warders with a firm hand, then new boundaries would have to be worked out, at least with warders who could channel. It seemed unlikely that bonding them would stop now. Beldain was evidence for that. People never really changed, yet the world did, with disturbing regularity. You just had to live with it, or at least live through it. Now and then, with luck, you could affect the direction of the changes, but even if you stopped one, you only set another in motion. As expected, she did not find the door to the Althor boys' rooms unguarded. Olivia was there, of course, seated on a bench to one side of the door with her hands folded patiently in her lap. The pale-haired Shanshan woman had appointed herself the boy's protector of sorts. Olivia credited him with freeing her from a Damani's collar, but there was more to it than that. Men disliked her, for one thing, and it was not the usual sort of jealousy. Olivia hardly seemed to know what men and women did together. But there was a connection between her and the boy, a connection revealed in glances that carried determination on her side, and on his, hope, hard as that was to believe. Until Cadsuane knew what that was all about, she intended to do nothing to separate them. Olivia's sharp blue eyes regarded Cadsuane with a respectful wariness, but she did not see an enemy. Olivia had a short way with those she considered the Althor boys' enemies. The other woman on guard was much of a size with Olivia, but the two could not have been more different, and not just because Elza's eyes were brown, and she had the smooth, ageless look of Aes Sedai, where Olivia had fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and threads of white almost hidden in her hair. Elza leaped to her feet as soon as she saw Cadsuane, drawing herself up in front of the door and wrapping herself tight in her shawl. "He is not alone," she said, frost rhyming her voice. "Do you mean to stand in my way?" Cadsuane asked, just as coldly. The Andoran green should have moved aside. Elza stood far enough below her in the power that she should not have hesitated, much less waited for a command, but the woman planted her feet, and her gaze actually grew heated. It was a quandary. Aya's other sisters in the manor house had sworn fealty to the boy, and those who had been loyal to Elida all stared at Cadsuane as if suspicious of her intentions toward him, which raised the question of why Varen did not, of course. But only Elza tried to keep her away from him. The woman's attitude reeked of jealousy, which made no sense. She could not possibly believe herself better suited to advise him, and if there had been any suggestion that Elza desired the boy as a man or a warder, men would have been snarling. The girl had finely honed instincts there. Cadsuane would have ground her teeth, had she been the sort of woman to grind her teeth. At the point when she thought she would have to order Elza to step aside, Olivia leaned forward. "You did send for her, Elza," she drawled. "He'll be upset if we keep her out. Upset with us, not her. Let her in." Elza glanced at the Shanshan woman from the corner of her eye, and her lip curled in contempt. Olivia stood far above her in the power. Olivia stood well above Cadsuane, for that matter, but she was a wilder, and a liar in Elza's view. The dark-haired woman hardly seemed to accept that Olivia had been Damani, much less the rest of her story. Still, Elza darted a look at Cadsuane, then at the door behind her, and shifted her shawl. Plainly, she did not want the boy upset. Not with her. "I'll see whether he's ready for you," she said, very near to sullen. "Keep her here," she added to Olivia more sharply before turning to knock lightly at the door. A male voice called from the other side, and she opened the door just wide enough to slip in, pulling it shut behind her. "You'll have to forgive her," Olivia said, in that irritatingly slow, soft Shanshan accent.
Hell yeah,
"I think
fire.
it's
That's
just that she
badass.
takes her oath very seriously. She isn't used to serving anyone." "Aes Sedai keep their word," Cadsuane replied dryly. The woman made her feel as if her own way of talking were as quick and crisp as a Kyrianen's. "We must." "I think you do. Just so you know, I keep my word, too. I owe him anything he wants of me." A fascinating comment, and an opening, but before she could take advantage of it, Elza came out. Behind her came Algarin, white beard trimmed to a neat point. He offered Cadsuane a bow, with a smile that deepened the wrinkles of his face. His plain coat of dark wool, made in his younger days, hung loosely on him now, and the hair on his head provided a thin covering. There was no chance to find out why he had been visiting the Althor boy. "He will see you now," Elsa said sharply. Cadsuane very nearly did grind her teeth.
Oh, shit. Hell yeah, that's
Olivia
badass
would have to
fire.
wait. And Algarin. The boy was on his feet when Cadsuane entered,
This is
almost as
something that
tall
he's
and broad-shouldered
enjoying
as Lan, in a black coat worked with gold on the sleeves and the high collar. It was too much like an Ashaman's coat with embroidery added to suit her, but she said nothing. He made a courteous bow, ushering her to a chair with a tasseled cushion in front of the fireplace, and asking whether she would like wine. That in the pitcher, sitting on a side table with 2 wine cups, had gone cold, but he could send for more. She had worked hard enough to force him into civility. He could wear any coat he wanted. There were more important matters he had to be guided in, or prodded, or pulled as need be. She was not going to waste time or talk on his clothing. Inclining her head politely, she declined the wine. A wine cup offered many opportunities, to sip when you needed a moment's thought, to peer into when you wished to hide your eyes, yet this young man needed watching every moment. His face gave away almost as little as a sister's. With that dark reddish hair and those blue-gray eyes, he could have passed for Aiel, but few Aiel had eyes that cold. They made the morning sky she had been staring at earlier seem warm, colder than they had been before Shadar Logoth. Harder, too, unfortunately. They also looked weary. "Algarin had a brother who could channel," he said, turning toward a facing chair. Halfway into the turn, he staggered. He caught himself on an arm of the chair with a barked laugh, pretending he had tripped over his own boots. But there had been no tripping. And he had not seized Saidin. She had seen him stagger doing that, or her ornaments would have warned her. Coriel said he only needed a little more sleep to recover from Shadar Logoth. Light, she needed to keep the boy alive, or it had all been for nothing. "I know," she said. And since it seemed Algarin might have told him everything, she added, "I was the one who captured Imarin and took him to Tarvalon." A strange thing for Algarin to be grateful for, in some eyes, but his younger brother survived being gentled for more than 10 years after she had helped him reconcile to it. The brothers had been close. The boy's eyebrows twitched as he settled into his chair. He had not known. "Algarin wants to be tested," he said. She met his gaze levelly, serenely, and held her tongue. Algarin's children were married, those who still lived. Maybe he was ready to turn this piece of land over to his descendants. In any case, one man more or less who could channel hardly made any difference at this point. Unless it was the boy who was staring at her. After a moment, his chin moved, the vestige of a nod. Had he been testing her? "Never fear that I'll fail to tell you when you're being a fool, boy." Most people remembered that after one meeting she had a sharp tongue. This young man required reminding from time to time. He grunted. It might have been a laugh. It might have been rueful. She reminded herself that he wanted her to teach him something, though he did not seem to know what. No matter. She had a list to choose from, and she had only begun on it. His face might have been carved from stone for all the expression he showed, but he bounded to his feet and began to pace back and forth between the fireplace and the door. His hands were clenched in fists behind his back. "I've been talking with Olivia about the Shonchan," he said. "They call their army the ever-victorious army for a reason. It's never lost a war. Battles, yes, but never a war. When they lose a battle, they sit down and work out what they did wrong or what the enemy did right. Then they change what needs changing for them to win." "A wise way," she said when the flow of words paused. Plainly, he expected some comment. "I know men who do the same. Davram Bashir, for one. Gareth Bryn, Brodel Eteralda, Agilmar Jagad. Even Pedron Nile did when he was alive. All judged great captains." "Yes," he said, still pacing. He did not look at her, perhaps did not see her, but he was listening. It was to be hoped that he actually heard as well. 5 men, all great captains. The Shanshan all do it. That's been their way for 1,000 years. They change what they have to change, but they don't give up. Are you considering the possibility they can't be defeated? She asked calmly. Calmness always suited until you knew the facts, and usually after, too. The boy rounded on her, stiff-necked and eyes like ice. I can defeat them eventually, he said, struggling to keep his tone civil. That much was to the good. The less often she had to prove that she could and would punish transgressions of her rules, the better. But he cut off with a growl as the sounds of argument in the hallway penetrated the door. A moment later, the door swung open, and Elsa backed into the room, still arguing in a loud voice and trying to hold back 2 other sisters with her spread arms. Arian, her pale face flushed with color, was pushing the other green ahead of her physically. Serene, a woman so beautiful she made Arian look almost ordinary, wore a cooler expression, as might be expected from a white, but she was shaking her head in exasperation, and hard enough to make the colorful beads in her thin braids click together. Serene possessed a temper, though she normally kept it sealed away tightly. Bartol and Rashan do be coming, Arian announced loudly, agitation thickening Ilion in her speech. Those were her 2 warders left behind in Kyrian. I did no send for them, but someone did travel with them. An hour ago I felt them suddenly closer, and just now closer again. They're coming toward us now. My Vitalian, he also is coming closer, Serene said. He will be here in a few hours, I think. Elsa let her arms drop, though from the stiffness of her back she was still glaring at the 2 sisters. My Pharaoh will be here shortly as well, she muttered. He was her only warder. It was said they were married, and Greens who married seldom took another warder at the same time. Cadsuane wondered whether she would have spoken if the others had not. I didn't expect it so soon, the boy said softly. Softly, but there was steel in his voice. But I shouldn't have expected events to wait on me, should I, Cadsuane? Events never wait on anyone, she said, standing. Arian flinched as if she had just noticed her, though Cadsuane was sure her face was as smooth as the boy's, and maybe as stony at that. What had brought those warders from Kyrian, and who had traveled with them, might be problems enough to go on with, but she thought she had gotten another answer from the boy, and she was going to have to consider very carefully how to advise him on it. Sometimes the answers were thornier than the questions.
Chapter 24. A Strengthening Storm. Mid-afternoon sunlight should have been slanting through the windows of Rand's bedchamber, but a hard rain was falling outside, while the lamps were lit to hold off a twilight darkness. Thunder rattled the glass-filled casements and windows. It was a fierce storm that had rolled down out of the dragon wall faster than a running horse and brought a deeper cold, almost deep enough for snow. The raindrops pelting the house were half-frozen slush. Despite blazing logs and hearthstone, a chill clung to the room. Lying on his bed with his booted feet propped one atop the other on the coverlet, he stared up at the canopy and tried to put his thoughts in order. He could disregard the thunderstorm outside, but Min, snuggling under his arm, was another matter. She did not try to distract him. She just did it without trying. What was he to do about her? About Elaine and Alienda? Those 2 were only vague presences in his head at this distance from Camelin. At least, he assumed they were still in Camelin. Assuming was dangerous when it came to those 2. All he had of them at the moment was a general sense of direction and knowledge they were alive. Min's body was pressed tight against his side, though, and the bond made her as vibrant inside his head as she was in the flesh. Was it too late to keep Min safe? To keep Elaine and Alienda safe? What makes you think you can keep anyone safe? Who's there? Whispered in his head. The dead madman was an old friend now. We are all going to die. Just hope that you aren't the one who kills them. Not a welcome friend, just one he could not rid himself of. He no longer feared killing Min or Elaine or Avienda, any more than he feared going mad. Madder than he already was, at least, with a dead man in his head and sometimes a foggy face he could almost recognize. Did he dare ask Cat Swain about either one? Trust no one, Luz Theron murmured, then gave a wry laugh. Including me. Without warning, Min punched him in the ribs hard enough to make him grunt. You're getting melancholy, sheepherder, she growled. If you're worrying about me again, I swear I'll... She had so many different ways of growling, Min did. Each matched to very different sensations through the bond. There was the light irritation he felt from her now. This time touched with worry. Sometimes there was a sharp edge, as if she were refraining from snapping his head off. There was a growl that almost made him laugh from the amusement in her head, or as close to laughing as he had come in what seemed a very long time, and a throaty growl that would have heated his blood, even without the bomb. None of that now, she said warningly, before he could move the hand resting on her back, and rolled off the bed to her feet, tugging her embroidered coat straight with a reproving look. Since bonding him, she was even better at reading his mind than she had been good enough before. What are you going to do about them, Rand? What is Cat Swain going to do? Lightning flashed in the windows, just bright enough to wash out flaps. Thunder boomed against the window glass. I haven't yet been able to see what she was going to do ahead of time, Min. Why should today be different? The thick feather mattress sagged beneath him as he swung his legs up its side and sat up facing her. He almost pressed a hand to the old wounds in his side without thinking, and caught himself and changed the movement of buttoning of his coat. Half healed and never healing, those two overlapping wounds hurt since Shada Lucas. Maybe he was just more aware of how they throbbed. They heated them a furnace of fever, trapped in an area smaller than the palm of his hand. One, at least he hoped, would begin to heal with Shada Lucas gone. Maybe there had just not been enough time yet for him to feel any difference. It was not the same side that Min had fisted. She was always gentle with that, not always with the rest of him. But he thought he had kept the pain hidden from her. No point in giving her something more to worry over. The concern in her eyes and in her head must be about Cat Swain. Or the others. The manor house and all of its outlying buildings were crowded now. It had seemed inevitable that sooner or later someone would try using the waters left in Carian. Their Aes Sedai had not declared that they were going off to find the dragon reborn, but neither had they been particularly secretive. Even so, he had never anticipated those who had arrived with them. Davram Bashir, with 100 of his Saldean light horse, dismounting in a wind-driven soaking rain and muttering about ruined saddles. There were half a dozen black-coated Ashaman, who for some reason had not shielded themselves from the downpour. They rode with Bashir, but it had been like two parties arriving, a little distance between them always, a strong whiff of watchful wariness. And one of the Ashaman was Logain Ablar. Logain? An Ashaman wearing the sword and dragon on his collar. Bashir and Logain both wanted to talk to him, but not in front of anyone, especially each other, it seemed. Unexpected enough, though, they were hardly the most surprising of the visitors. He had thought the 8 Aes Sedai must be more friends of Cat Swain, but he would swear she had been as surprised as he to see most of them. Odder, all but one seemed to be with the Ashaman. Not prisoners, and certainly not guards. But Logain had been reluctant to explain with Bashir present. Bashir reluctant to leave Logain the first chance to talk to Rand alone. Now they were all drying off and settling into their rooms, leaving him to try to put his thoughts in order, to the extent that he could, with Min close by. What would Cat Swain do? Well, he had tried to ask her advice. Events had outrun both of them, though. The decision had been made, whatever Cat Swain thought. Lightning flashed again in the windows. Lightning seemed to suit Cat Swain. You could never tell where it would strike. Olivia would finish her, Luz Theron muttered. She's going to help us die. She'd remove Cat Swain for us if you tell her to. I don't want to kill her, Rand thought of the dead man. I can't afford for her to die. Luz Theron knew that as well as he, but the man grumbled under his breath anyway. Since Shadar Logoth, he seemed to touch less mad sometimes. Or maybe Rand was a touch more. After all, he thought talking to a dead man in his head as a matter of every day. That was hardly sane. You have to do something, Maeve muttered, folding her arms beneath her breasts. Logain's aura still speaks of glory, stronger than ever. Maybe he still thinks he's the real dragon reborn. And there's something dark in the images I saw around Lord Deborah. If he turns against you or dies, I heard one of the soldiers say, Lord Dobrain might die. Losing even one of them would be a blow. Lose all three, and it might take you a year to recover. If you've seen it, then it's going to happen. I have to do what I can and not worry over what I can't. She gave him one of those looks women had in great store, as if he were trying to start an argument. A scratching at the door brought his head around and made Min shift her stance.
Hell yeah, we'll do another
Mrs.
job
Baker
at Jesse
took a
said.
throwing knife out of her sleeve and was hiding it behind her wrist. The woman carried more knives tucked about her than Tom Maryland had, or Matt. Colors whirled in his head, almost resolving into what? A man on a wagon seat. Not the face that sometimes appeared in his thoughts anyway, and the scene was gone in an instant, without any of the dizziness that accompanied the face. Come, he called, standing up. Elsa spread her dark green skirts in an elegant curtsy when she entered, her eyes bright on his face. A pleasant-appearing woman, and wholly complacent as a cat, she hardly seemed to see Min. Of all the sisters who had sworn to him, Elsa was the most eager, the only eager one, really. The others had their reasons for swearing, their explanations, and of course Farron and the sisters who came to find him at Demise Wells had no real choice, facing a Tavira. But for all Elsa's outer coolness, she seemed to burn inside with a passion to see he reach Tom and guide him. You said to let you know when the Ogier came, she said, never taking her eyes from his face. Loyal! Min shouted gleefully, tucking her knife back up her sleeve as she rushed past Elsa, who blinked at the sight of the blade. I could have killed Rand for letting you get off to your room before I saw you. The bond said she did not mean it. Not exactly. Thank you, Rand told Elsa, listening to the sounds of merriment from the sitting room, Min's light laughter and Loyal's quake of Ogier mirth, like the earth laughing. Thunder rolled across the sky. Perhaps the Aes Sedai's passion extended to wanting to know what he said to Loyal, because her lips thinned and she hesitated before making another curtsy and sweeping out of the bedchamber. A brief pause in the sounds of pleasure announced her passage across the sitting room, and their resumption, her departure. Only then did he seize the power. He tried never to let anyone see him do that. Fire flooded into him, hotter than the sun, and cold to make the worst blizzard seem spring, all a swirling rage that dwarfed the storm outside, threatening to scour him away for a moment's inattention. Seizing Saidin was a war for survival. But the green of the cornices was suddenly greener, the black of his coat blacker, the gold of its embroidery more golden. He could see the grain of the vine-carved bedposts, see faint marks left by the craftsman's sanding all those years ago. Saidin made him feel as if he had been half blind and numb without him. That was a part of what he felt. He was there, whispered. You're clean again. It was. The foulness that had marked the male half of the power since the breaking was gone. That did not stop nausea from rising in Rand, though, the violent urge to bend double and empty himself on the floor. The room seemed to spin for an instant, and he had to put a hand on the nearest bedpost to steady himself. He did not know why he should still feel the sickness, the taint going. Who's there did not know, or would not tell. But the sickness was the reason he could not let anyone see him take hold of Saidin, if he could help it. Elsa might burn to see him reach the last battle, but too many others wanted to see him fall. Not all of them ghost friends. In that moment of weakness, the dead man reached for Saidin. Rand could feel him clawing for it greedily. Was it harder than it had been to push him away? In some ways, those there seemed more solidly part of him since Charlovis. It did not matter. He had only so far left to go before it could die. He just had to last that far. Drawing a deep breath, he ignored the lingering traces of sickness in his belly and strode into the sitting room to the crash of thunder. Min stood in the middle of the room, holding one of Loyal's hands in both of hers and smiling up at him. It took both of her hands to hold one of Loyal's, and the pair did not come close to covering him. The top of his head missed the plaster ceiling by a little more than a foot. He had donned a fresh coat of dark blue wool, the bottom flaring over baggy trousers to the tops of his knee-high boots. But for once, his pockets did not bulge with the angular shapes.
Be right back.
eyes the size of teacups.
I gotta go get my
Lit up
other
at the sight
little
of
dab
Rand.
rig. This one
The
needs to
grin
be
on his wide
charged.
mouth really did split his
So I'll
face
be
in
right
two.
back.
The tufted ears sticking up through his shaggy hair quivered with pleasure.
Lord Algarin has full your guest rooms, Rand.
He boomed in a voice like a deep drum.
Can you imagine it? 6 of them. Of course, they haven't been used in some time, but they're aired out every week, so there isn't any mustiness. And the bed sheets are very good linen. I thought I'd be back to doubling myself up in a human-sized bed. We aren't staying here long, are we?
His long ears sagged a little, then began to twitch uneasily.
I don't think we should. I mean, I might get used to having a real bed, and that wouldn't do if I'm going to stay with you. I mean, well, you know what I mean.
I know, Rand said softly. He could have laughed at the Ogier's consternation. He should have laughed. Laughter just seemed to have escaped him lately. Spinning a web against eavesdropping around the room, he knotted it so he could release his iodine. The last traces of nausea began to fade immediately. He could control the sickness, usually, with an effort, but there was no point when he did not have to. Did any of your books get wet? Boyle's main concern coming in had been to check on his books. Suddenly it struck him that he had thought of what he had done as spinning a web. That was how Luce Theron would put it. That sort of thing happened too often. The other man's turns of phrase drifting into his head, the other man's memories mingling with his. He was Randolph Thor, not Luce Theron Telemon. He had woven a ward and tied off the wheel, not spun a web and knotted it. But the one came to him as easily as the other.
My essays of Willem Menetjes got damp.
Boyle said disgustedly, rubbing his upper lip with a finger the thickness of a sausage. Had he been careless shaving, or was that the beginning of a mustache beneath his wide nose?
The pages may spot. I shouldn't have been so careless, not with a book. And my book of notes took some wet too, but the ink didn't run. Everything is still readable, but I really need to make a case to protect it.
Slowly a frown crept onto his face, dangling the long ends of his eyebrows onto his cheeks.
You look tired, Ryan. He looks tired, Min.
He's been doing too much, but he's resting now, Min said defensively, and Rand did smile. A little. Min would always defend him, even to his friends. You are resting, sheepherder, she added, letting go of Loyal's huge hand and planting her fists on her hips. Sit down and rest. Oh, sit down, Loyal. I'll put a crick in my neck if I keep staring up at you. Loyal chuckled, the bellowing of a bull muted in his throat, as he examined one of the straight-back chairs dubiously. Compared to him, it seemed a chair made for a child.
Sheepherder. You don't know how good it is to hear you calling him sheepherder, Min.
He sat down cautiously. The plain-carved chair creaked under his weight, and his knees stuck up in front of him.
I am sorry, Rand, but it is funny, and I haven't heard much to laugh at these past months.
The chair was holding. With a quick glance toward the hall door, he added, a little too loudly,
Coraldin doesn't have much sense of humor.
You can speak freely, Rand told him. We're safe behind a ward. He'd almost said behind a shield, which was not the same thing, except that he knew it was. He was too weary to sit, just as he was too tired to find sleep easily most nights. His bones ached with it. So he went to stand in front of the fireplace. Winds gusting across the chimney top made the flames dance on the split log, and sometimes let a small puff of smoke into the room. And he could hear the rain drumming away at the windows,
Okay.
but the thunder seemed to
I
have
think
cooled
it's
down,
fit. It's fixed
like
now.
the storm was ending. Clasping his hands behind his back, he turned away from the fire. What did the elders say, Loyal? Instead of answering straight away, Loyal looked at Min as if seeking encouragement or support.
I'll be right back again.
Perched on the edge of a blue armchair with her knees crossed, he smiled at the Ogier and nodded. Then he sighed heavily, a wind gusting through deep caverns.
Coraldin and I visited every stepping land, all but steadying Shanghai, of course. I couldn't go there, but I left a message everywhere we went. And Daiting isn't far from Shanghai. Someone would carry it there. The Great Stump is meeting in Shanghai, and that will attract crowds. This is the first time a great stump has been called in 1,000 years. Not since you humans fought the War of the 100 Years. And it was Shanghai's turn. They must be considering something very important, but no one would tell me why it was called. They won't tell you about any stuff until you hold beard, he muttered,
fingering a narrow patch of stubble on his broad chin. Apparently he intended to remedy his lack, though it was not certain that he could. Loyal was over 90 years old now, yet for an Ogier, that was still a boy. The elders, Rand asked patiently. Who had to be patient with Loyal, with any Ogier? They did not see time the way humans did. Who among humans would think of whose turn it was after 1,000 years? And Loyal tended to go on at length, given half a chance. Great length. Loyal's ears twitched, and he gave Min another look, received another encouraging smile in return.
Well, as I said, I visited all the steading but Shanghai. Calden wouldn't go inside. He'd rather sleep every night under a bush than be cut off from the source for a minute.
Rand did not say a word, but Loyal raised his hands and smoothed his palms out.
I'm getting to the point, Rand. I am.
Damn it.
I don't know whether it was enough.
Just got comfortable and I gotta get up again. I forgot to get my dab right.
To older and wiser hands. So did Shadun and Mordu in the mountains on the Shadow
Right, and I got
Coast.
comfortable.
The other setting agreed to guard the way gates. I don't think they really believe there's any danger, but they agreed. So you know they will keep a close guard. And I'm sure someone will take word to Shanghai. The elders in Shanghai never liked having a way gate right outside the steading. I must have heard Elder Hammond say 100 times that it was dangerous. I know they'll agree to have it watched.
Rand nodded slowly. Ogier never lied, or at least the few who made an attempt were so poor at it, that they seldom tried a second time. And Ogier's word was taken as seriously as anyone else's sworn oath. The way gates would be guarded closely, except for those in the borderlands and the mountains south of Amadicia and Terravon. From gate to gate, a man could journey from the spine of the world to the Arctic Ocean, the borderlands to the Sea of Storms, all in a strange world somehow outside of time, or maybe alongside it. 2 days walking along the ways could carry you 100 miles or 500, depending on the paths you chose, and if you were willing to risk the dangers. You could die very easily in the ways, or worse. The ways had turned dark and corrupted long ago. Frolics did not care about that, though, at least not when they had Murkrol driving them. Frolics cared only for killing, especially when they had Murkrol driving them. And 9 way gates would remain unwatched, the danger that any of them might open up to let out Frolics by the tens of thousands. Setting any sort of guard without the setting's cooperation might be impossible. Many people did not believe Ogier existed.
Smoke a joint.
Few of those who did wanted to meddle without leave. Maybe the Ashima. They had enough they could
I
try.
think I'm hurting a lot more too because
Suddenly, he realized that he was not the only
the
one.
weather is about to happen this
Loyal was
weekend.
worn and gone. His coat was rumpled and hung loosely on him. It was dangerous for an Ogier to be
It's
outside
supposed
the
to be getting
steading too long.
snow.
Loyal had left his home about
Back's
5 years
under
ago.
a
Maybe those
winter
first visits
storm
to the
warning
Western
right now.
had not been enough for him. Maybe you should go home now, Loyal. Steading Shanghai is only a few days from here. Loyal's chair creaked alarmingly as he sat bolt upright. His ears shot upright too, in alarm.
Oh, damn, that's
My mother
crazy.
would be there, Rand. She's a famous
Uh,
speaker. She
we're
would
only
never
at
miss a
about-
great stump.
We're in our low
She can't have
40s
come
right
all the way
now.
back from the 2 rivers already, Rand told him. Loyal's
We're
mother
supposed to
was
get down
be a famous
to
walker, too.
a low
You
of
have to wear limits
27.
even for Ogier.
You don't know my mother.
Loyal muttered, drum booming darkly.
She'll still have everything told too. She will.
Min leaned toward the Ogier, a dangerous light in her eyes. The way you talk about Eric, I know you want to marry her. So why do you keep running from her? Rand studied her from the fireplace. Marriage. Avienda assumed that he would marry her, and Elaine and Min as well, in Aiel fashion. Elaine appeared to think so too, strange as that seemed. Thought she did. Did Min think? She had never said. He should never have let them bond him. The bond would smother them in grief when he died. Loyal's ears trembled with caution now. Those ears were one reason Ogier made poor liars. He made placating gestures as though Min were the larger of them.
Well, do. Of course I do. Erin is beautiful and very perceptive. Did I ever tell you how carefully she listened to me explain about... of course I did. I tell everybody I did. I do want to marry her, but not yet. It isn't like with you humans, men. You do everything Rand asks. Erin will expect me to settle down and stay home. Wives never let a husband go anywhere or do anything. If it means leaving the steading for more than a few days, I have to finish my book. And how can I do that if I don't see everything Rand does? I'm sure he's done all sorts of things since I left Marion, and I know I'll never get it all down right. Erin just couldn't understand. Men, are you angry with me?
What makes you think I'm angry? She said coolly. Doyle sighed heavily, and so clearly in relief that Rand almost stared. Light, the Ogier actually thought she meant she was not angry. Rand knew he was feeling his way in the dark when it came to women, even men, maybe especially men. But Doyle had better learn a lot more than he already knew before he married his Aerith. Otherwise, she would skin him out like a sick goat. Best to get him out of the room before Min did Aerith's job for her. Rand cleared his throat. Think on it overnight, Doyle, he said. Maybe you'll change your mind by morning. Part of him hoped Doyle would. The Ogier had been too long. Another part of him, though, he could use Doyle. And what Olivia had told him about Sean Chang was true. Sometimes he disgusted himself. In any case, I need to talk to Bashir now. And Logain. His mouth tightened around the name. What was Logain doing in Ashamon's bag? Doyle did not stand. Indeed, his expression grew more troubled. Eyebrows drooped.
There is something I need to tell you about the Aes Sedai who came with us.
Lightning flared anew outside the windows as he went on. The thunder crashed overhead harder than ever. The sunstones, the lull only meant the worst was coming. I told you to kill them all when you had the chance, Luce Theron laughed. I told you.
Are you positive they've been bonded, Samitsu? Katsuen asked firmly, and loudly enough to be heard over the thunder booming on the manor house's rooftop. Thunder and lightning fit her mood. She would have liked to snarl. It required a goodly measure of her training and experience to sit calmly and sip hot ginger tea. She had not let emotion get the upper hand in a very long time, but she wanted to fight something or someone. Samitsu held a porcelain cup of tea, too, but she had yet to swallow a drop, and she had ignored Katsuen's offer of a chair. The slender sister turned from peering into the flames of the left-hand fireplace, the bells in her dark hair jingling as she shook her head. She had not bothered to dry her hair properly, and it hung damp and heavy down her back. Her hazel eyes were uneasy. It's hardly the sort of question I could ask a sister, now is it, Katsuen? And they certainly didn't tell you. As who would? At first I thought maybe they had done like Maurice and Kirill and poor Daigyan. A brief wince of sympathy crossed her face. She knew in full the pain that was gnawing at Daigyan over her loss. Any sister beyond her first order knew that too well. But it's plain Tovane and Gabriella are both with Logain. I think Gabriella is betting him. If there's bonding been done, it was the men who did it. Turnabout, Katsuen muttered into her tea. Some said that turnabout was fair play, but she had never believed in fighting fair. Either you fought or you did not, and it was never a game. Fairness was for people standing safely to one side, talking while others bled. Unfortunately, there was little she could do beyond trying to find a way to balance events. Balance was not at all the same as fairness. What a dog's dinner this was turning into. I'm glad you gave me at least a little warning before I have to face Tovane and the others, but I want you to return to Kyrian the first thing tomorrow. There was nothing I could do, Katsuen, Samitsu said bitterly. Half the people in order had begun checking with Sashal to see if it was right, and the other half told me to my face she'd already said different. Lord Bashir talked her into turning the warders loose. I have no idea how he found out about them in the first place, and she talked Sora Leah into it, and there wasn't the least thing I could do to stop it. Sora Leah was behaving as if I had just abdicated. She doesn't understand, and she made it plain she thinks I'm a fool. There's no point at all in me going back, unless you expect me to carry Sashal's gloves for her. I expect you to watch her, Simitsu. No more than that. I want to know what one of these dragon-sworn sisters does when neither I nor the wise ones are looking over their shoulders and holding a switch. You've always been very observant. Patience was not always her strongest trait, but sometimes it was required with Simitsu. The yellow was observant and intelligent and strong-willed most of the time, not to mention the best alive at healing, at least until the appearance of Donna Flynn. But she could suffer the most astonishing collapses in her confidence. The stick never worked with Simitsu, but pats on the back did, and it was ridiculous not to use what worked. As Catswain reminded her how intelligent she was, how skilled at healing, that was always necessary with Simitsu. She could go into a depression over failing to heal a dead man. How clever the Alathalan sister began to draw up her composure and her self-assurance. You can be assured Sashal won't change her stockings without I know it, she said, crystal. In truth, Catswain expected no less. But if you don't mind me asking, with her confidence restored, Simitsu's tone made that the merest courtesy. She was no shrinking flower except when her self-assurance weakened. Why are you here at the back end of Tyr? What's young Althor going to do? Or should I say, what are you going to have him do? He intends something very dangerous, Catswain replied. Lightning flashed outside the windows, sharp silver forks in a sky near as dark as night. She knew exactly what he intended. She just did not know whether to stop it.
It has to end, Brand thundered, echoed by the crashes in the sky. He had doffed his coat before this interview, rolled up his shirt sleeves to bear the dragons twined around his forearms in scarlet and gold, the golden maned heads resting on the backs of his hands. He wanted the man in front of him reminded with every look that he was facing the dragon reborn. But his hands were fists, to keep him from giving in to loose Theron's urgings and throttling bloody Loghain Outlaw. I don't need a war with the White Tower, and you bloody Ashaman bloody well won't give me a war with the White Tower. Do I make myself understood? Loghain, hands resting easily atop the long hilt of his sword, did not flinch. He was a big man, if smaller than Rand, with a steady gaze that gave no sign that he'd been dressed down or called to account. The silver sword and red and gold dragon glittered brightly in the lamplight on the high collar of his black coat, and that itself looked freshly ironed. Are you saying release them? He asked calmly. Will the Aes Sedai release those of ours they've taken? No, Rand said curtly, and sourly. What's done can't be undone. Maurice had been so shocked when he suggested she release Norishma, who would have thought he was asking her to abandon a puppy by the side of the and he suspected Flynn would fight as hard to hang on to Kirill as she to him. He was fairly certain there was more between those two than bond now. Well, if an Aes Sedai could bond a man who channeled, what was to say a pretty woman could not fix on a gimpy old man? You realize the mess you've created, though, don't you? As it is, the only man who can channel that Elida wants alive is me, and that only till the last battle is done. Once she learns of this, she'll be twice as hot to see you all dead any way she can manage it. I don't know how the other lot will react, but Egwene was always a sharp bargainer. I may have to tell off Ashaman for Aes Sedai to bond until they have as many of you as you do of them. As if they don't just decide you all have to die as soon as they can arrange it too. What's done is done, but there cannot be any more. Loghain stiffened a little more with every word, but his gaze held on Rand's. It was plain as horns on a ram that he was ignoring the others in the sitting room. Min had wanted no part of this meeting, and had taken herself off to read. Rand could not make up from down in Herod Fell's books, which she found impressive. He had insisted Loyal remain, though, and the Ogier was pretending to study the flames in the fireplace, except when he glanced at the door, tufted ears twitching as if wondering whether he could slip out unnoticed under cover of the storm. Davram Bashir appeared even shorter than he really was alongside the Ogier, a graying man with dark tilted eyes, a beak of a nose, and thick mustaches curving down around his mouth. He had worn his sword, too, a shorter blade than Loghain's, and serpentine. Bashir spent more time peering into his wine cup than looking at anything else, but whenever his eyes touched Logain, he unconsciously ran a thumb along his sword hilt. Rand thought it was unconscious.
Dain gave the order.
Logain said, openly uncomfortable explaining himself in front of an audience. Sudden lightning close to the house cast his face in lurid shadows for an instant, a bleak mask of darkness.
I assumed it came from you.
His eyes moved slightly in Bashir's direction, and his mouth tightened.
Taim does a great many things people think are your direction,
He went on reluctantly.
but he has his own plans. Flynn and Narishma and Manfor are on the deserters list, like every Ashaman you kept with you. And he has a coterie of 20 or 30 he keeps close and trains privately. Every man who wears the dragon is one of that group except me. And he'd have kept the dragon from me if he dared. No matter what you've done, it is time to turn your eyes to the Black Tower before Taim splits it worse than the White Tower is. If he does, you'll find the larger part is loyal to him, not you. They know him. Most have never even seen you.
Irritably, Rand pushed his sleeves down and dropped into a chair. What he had done made no matter to Logain. The man knew Saidin was clean, but he could not believe Rand or any man had actually done the cleansing. Did he think the Creator had decided to stretch out a merciful hand after 3,000 years of suffering? The Creator had made the world and then left humankind to make of it what they would. Heaven or the pit of doom by their choosing. The Creator had made many worlds, watched each flower or die, and gone on to make endless worlds beyond. The gardener did not weep for each blossom that fell. For an instant he thought those must have been Luce Theron's reflections. He had never gone on that way about the Creator or anything else that he recalled. But he could feel Luce Theron nodding in approval. A man listening to someone else. Still, it was not the kind of thing he would have considered before Luce Theron. How much space remained between them? Taim will have to wait, he said wearily. How long could Taim wait? He was surprised not to hear Luce Theron raging for him to kill the man. He wished that made him feel easier. Did you just come to see that Logain reached me safely, Bashir? Or to tell me somebody stabbed Dobrain? Or do you have an urgent task for me, too? Bashir raised an eyebrow at Rand's tone, and his jaw tightened as he glanced at Logain. But after a moment, he snorted so hard his thick mustaches should have shaken. 2 men ransacked my tent, he said, setting his wine cup down on a carved blue table against the wall. One carrying a note I could swear I wrote myself if I didn't know better. In order to carry away certain items. Loyal tells me the fellows who knocked Dobrain had the same sort of note, apparently in Dobrain's hand. A blind man could see what they were after with a little thought. Dobrain and I are the most likely candidates to be guarding the seals for you. You have 3, and you say 3 are broken. Maybe the Shadow knows where the last is. Loyal had turned from the fireplace as the Saldaean spoke, his ears rigid, and now he burst out.
That is serious, Rand. If someone breaks all the seals on the Dark One's prison, or maybe even just 1 or 2 more, the Dark One could break free. Even you can't face the Dark One. I mean, I know the prophecies say you will, but that has to be just a way of speaking.
Even Logain looked concerned, his eyes studying Rand as if measuring him against the Dark One. Rand leaned back in his chair, careful not to let his tiredness show. The seals in the Dark One's prison on one hand, Taim splitting the Ashaman on the other. Was the 7th seal already broken? Was the Shadow beginning the opening moves of the last battle? You told me something once, Bashir. If your enemy offers you 2 targets, strike at a 3rd, Bashir finished promptly. Rand nodded. He had already decided anyway. Thunder rattled the windows till the casements shook. The storm was strengthening. I can't fight the Shadow and the Shan-Chan at the same time. I'm sending the 3 of you to arrange a truce with the Shan-Chan. Bashir and Logain seemed stunned into silence, until they began to argue, one on top of the other. Loyal just looked ready to faint.
Elsa fidgeted, listening to Fierro report what had occurred since she left him in Kyrian. Anne's harsh voice that irritated her. She hated Lightfoot, and wished she could ward away the violent lights flashing in the windows as she had warded her room against eavesdropping. No one would think her wish for privacy strange, since she had spent 20 years convincing everyone that she was married to the pale-haired man. Despite his voice, Theo looked the sort a woman would marry, tall and lean and quite pretty. The hard edge to his mouth only made his face more so, really. Of course, some might think it peculiar that she had never had more than one boarder at a time if they stopped to think about it. A man with just the right qualifications was difficult to find, but perhaps she should start looking. Lightning lit up the windows again. Yes, enough, she broke in finally. You did the right thing, Theo. It would have been taken as odd if you were the only one to refuse to find your eyes to die. A sense of relief flashed through the bond. She was strict about obedience to her orders, and while he knew she could not kill him, would not at least, punishment only required her to mask the bond so she did not share his pain. That, and a ward to muffle his screams. She disliked screaming almost as much as she disliked lightning. It is just as well you're with me, she went on. A pity that the Aiel's savages were still holding Farah, though she would have to quiz the Blight on exactly why she had sworn before she could be trusted. Until the journey to Tyrion, she had not known she shared anything with Farah. A very great pity that none of her own heart was with her, but only she had been sent to Tyrion, and she did not question the orders she received any more than Firil questioned those she gave. I think a few people are going to have to die soon, as soon as she decided which ones. Firil bowed his head, and a jolt of pleasure came through the bond. He did like killing. In the meanwhile, you will kill anyone who threatens the Dragon Reborn. Anyone. After all, it had become perfectly clear to her, while she herself was captive of the savages. The Dragon Reborn had to reach Tom and guide them, or how could the Great Lord defeat him there?
Chapter 25. When to wear shoes. Perrin strode impatiently up and down the flowered carpets that floored the tent, shrugging with discomfort at the dark green silk coat he had seldom worn since Vail had had it made. She said the elaborate silver embroidery suited his shoulders, but the wide leather belt supporting his axe at his side, the one as plain as the other, only pointed out that he was a fool pretending to be more than he was. Sometimes he tugged his gauntlets tighter, glared at his fur-lined cloak, lying across the back of the chair ready for him to put on. Twice he pulled a sheet of paper from his sleeve and unfolded it to study the sketched map of Malden while he paced. That was the town where Vail was being held. Jondon and Geth and Hugh had caught up to the fleeing inhabitants of Malden, but the only useful thing they had gotten was this map, and making anyone pause long enough to provide that had been a chore. Those strong enough to fight were dead or wearing Guyshine white from Shido. Those who remained to flee were the old and the very young, the sick and the lame. According to Jondon, the thought that someone might force them to return and fight the Shido had quickened their steps north toward Andor in safety. The map was a puzzle, with its maze of streets and the Lady's Fortress and the Great Cistern in the northeast corner. It tantalized him with possibilities, but they were possibilities only if you found a solution to the puzzle that was not shown on the map. The huge mass of Shido surrounding the walled town, not to mention 400 or 500 Shido wise ones from channels. So the map went back into his sleeve, and he continued to pace. The red striped tent itself made him chafe as much as the map, and so did the furnishings. The gilt-edged chairs that folded for storage, and the mosaic-topped table that did not. The stand mirror, the mirrored washstand, and even the brass-bound chests standing in a row along an outer wall. It was barely light outside, and all 12 of the lamps were lit, mirrors sparkling. The braziers that had held off the night's freezing cold still contained a few embers.
First one
He had
down.
even had Fail's 2 silk hangings, worked with lines of birds and flowers, brought out and hung from the roof walls. He had let Lamgren trim his beard and shave his cheeks and neck. He had washed and donned clean clothes. He had had the tent set up as if Fail were going to return any moment from a ride.
Fuck.
Also, everyone would look at him and see a bloody lord. Look at him and feel confident. Every bit of it reminded him that Fail was not out riding. Tugging off one of his gauntlets, he felt in his coat pocket and ran his fingers along the rawhide cord tucked in there. 32 knots now. He did not need reminding of that. Sometimes he lay awake a whole night with a bedding that did not have fire in it, counting those knots. Somehow, they had become a connection to her. Anyway, wakefulness was better than nightmares. If you don't sit down, you're going to be too tired to ride to Soharbor, even with Niall's help, Verlaine said, sounding faintly amused. Just watching you is exhausting me. He managed not to glare at her. In a dark blue silk riding dress, a wide golden necklace studded with fire drops tied around her neck, a narrow crown of Mayenne holding a golden buckle flight above her brows. The first of Mayenne was seated atop her crimson cloak in one of the folding chairs with her hands folded around her red gloves in her lap. She looked as composed as an Aes Sedai, and she smelled patient. He did not understand why she had stopped smelling as if he were a fat lamb caught in brambles for her meal, but he almost felt grateful to her. It was good to have someone he could talk to about missing Faye. She listened and smelled of sympathy. I want to be here when, Gaul and the maidens bring in some prisoners. The slip made him grimace as much as the delay. It was as if he doubted. Sooner or later they would capture some of the chateau, yet apparently that was no easy matter. Taking prisoners did no good unless they could be brought away, and the chateau were only careless compared to other ideals. Sulin had been patient too, explaining it to him. It was getting so hard for him to be patient, though. What's keeping Arganda? He growled. As if the Gildanan's name had summoned him at last, Arganda pushed through the entry flaps, his face like stone and his eyes sunken. He looked as though he slept as little as Perrin. The short man wore his silvery breastplate, but no helmet. He had not shaved yet this morning, and graying stubble grizzled his chin. Dangling from one gauntleted hand, a fat leather purse clinked as he set it on the table alongside two already there. From the Queen's strongbox, he said sourly. He had said little the last 10 days that was not sour. Enough to cover our share and more. I had to break open the lock and put 3 men to guard the chest. It's a temptation to the best of them, with the lock broken. Good, Perrin said, trying not to sound too impatient. He did not care whether Arganda had set 100 men guarding his Queen's strongbox. His own purse was the smallest of the 3, and he had gleaned every bit of gold or silver he could find to make it up. Slinging his cloak around his shoulders, he picked up the purses and brushed past the man out into the gray morning. To his disgust, the camp had taken a more permanent air, though it was not by design, and there was nothing he could do about it. Many of the Two Rivers men slept under tents now, pale brown patched canvas rather than striped red like his, but big enough for 8 or 10 men each, with their ill-assorted polearms stacked in front. And the others had turned their temporary brush shelters into sturdy little huts of woven evergreen branches. The tents and huts made at best meandering rows, not at all like the rigid lines seen among the Gildanan and Mayenners, yet it still looked a little like a village, with paths and lanes through the snow trampled down to bare frozen earth. A neat stone fire ring surrounded each of the cook fires, where clusters of men stood cloaked and hooded against the cold, waiting for their breakfast. It was what was in those black iron cookpots that had Perrin moving this morning. With so many men hunting, game was growing thin on the ground, and everything else was running out. They were down to searching for squirrels' hoards of acorns to grind for stretching the oatmeal, and this late in the winter, what they found were old and dried out at best. The sour mixture filled the belly after a fashion, but you had to be hungry to get it down. Most of the faces Perrin could see were watching the cookpots eagerly. The last of the carts were rattling through a gap made in a ring of sharpened stakes around the camp, carrion and drivers swathed to their ears and hunched on their seats like dark sacks of wool. Everything the carts had held was stacked in the center of the camp. Empty, they lurched in the ruts left by the carts ahead, a single file disappearing into the surrounding forest. Perrin's appearance with Verlaine and Arganda at his heels caused a stir, although not among the hungry Two Rivers men. Oh, a few made cautious nods in his direction. One or two fools gave rough bows, but most still tried not to look at him when Verlaine was in the vicinity. Idiots. Stone-brained idiots. There were plenty of other people, though, gathered a little way from the red-striped tent, crowding into the lanes between the other tents. An unarmored Mayenner soldier in a gray coat came running with Verlaine's white mare, bowing and bending to hold her stirrup. Manura was already up on a sleek mare, almost as dark as Verlaine's mount was pale. Thin beaded braids hanging down her chest from the collar of her cloak, The Aes Sedai barely seemed to notice the woman she was supposed to advise. Back stiff, she peered fixedly toward the low Aiel tents, where nothing moved, with the thin wavering lines of smoke rising from the smoke holes. One-eyed Galen, in his red helmet and breastplate and eye patch, made up for the Terravana sisters' inattention, though. As soon as Berlain appeared, he barked an order that stiffened 50 of the winged guards to statues, long red-streamered steel-tipped lances upright at their sides. And when she mounted, Galen snapped another command that put them on their horses so smoothly they seemed to move as one. Arganda directed her friend toward the Aiel tents, frowned at the Mayenners, then stalked over to where as many Gildanan lancers waited, shining armor and conical green helmets, and spoke softly to the fellow who would be commanding them. A lean man named Hirayan, who Baron suspected was nobly born from the haughty gaze visible behind the face bars of his silvered helmet. Arganda was short enough that Hirayan had to bend to listen to what he had to say, and the necessity frosted the taller man's face even more. One of the men behind Hirayan was carrying a staff with a red banner bearing the 3 six-pointed silver stars of Gildan, instead of a green streamered lance. One of the winged guards carried Mayenne's golden hawk on blue. Aram was there too, though off to one side and not ready to ride. Wrapped in his putrid green cloak, sword hilt rising behind his shoulder, he shared his jealous scowls between the Mayenners and the Gildanan. When he saw Perrin, the man's scowl turned sullen. He hurried off, blundering through the 2 riversmen waiting for their breakfast. He did not pause to offer apologies when he bumped someone. Aram had grown increasingly touchy, snapping and sneering at everyone but Perrin as the days passed and he sat and waited. Yesterday, he had almost come to blows with a pair of Gildanan over something none of them could quite recall once they were separated, except that Aram said the Gildanan had no respect, and they said he had a bad mouth. That was why the former tinker was staying behind this morning. Things were likely to be touchy enough in So Harbor without Aram starting a fight when Perrin was not looking. Keep an eye on Aram, he said quietly when Dan brought up his bay. And keep a close eye on Arganda, he added, stuffing the purses into his saddlebags, buckling the flaps down tight. The weight of Berlain's contribution balanced his and Arganda's together very nicely. Well, she had cause to be generous. Her men were as hungry as anyone else. Arganda looks like a man ready to do something stupid to me. Staya frisked a little and tossed his head as Perrin took the reins. But the stallion settled quickly under a firm, gentle hand. Daniel rubbed his tusk-like mustaches with a cold, reddened knuckle and eyed Arganda sideways and exhaled heavily in the mist. I'll watch him, Lord Perrin, he muttered, giving his cloak a hitch. No matter what you said about me being in charge, as soon as you're out of sight, you won't listen to a thing I say. Unfortunately, that was true. Perrin would rather have taken Arganda with him and left Galen here, but neither had been willing to accept that. The Gildanan did accept that men and horses would begin starving soon unless food and water were found somewhere, but he could not make himself spend a day farther from the screen than he already was. In some ways, he seemed even more frantic than Perrin, or maybe just more ready to give in to it. Left to himself, Arganda would have been edging a little nearer the Shido every day until it was right under their noses. Perrin was ready to die to free Aiel. Arganda just seemed ready to die. Do what you can to keep him from doing anything stupid, then. After a moment, he added, as long as it doesn't come to blows. There was only so far he could expect Daniel to restrain the fellow, after all. There were 3 Gildanan for every 2 Riversmen, and Aiel would never be freed if it came to them killing each other. Perrin very nearly rested his head on the stayer's flank. He liked that he was tired, and he could not see any place ahead of him anywhere. A slow clump of hooves announced the arrival of Missouri and Seonid, with their 3 warders riding close behind, wrapped in cloaks that made most of each man vanish, along with part of his horse. Both Aes Sedai wore shimmering silk, and a heavy gold necklace, layers of thick strands, showed under the edge of Missouri's dark cloak. A small white jewel dangled onto Seonid's forehead from a fine golden chain fastened in her hair. Anura relaxed, settling more easily in her saddle. Back among the Aiel tents, the wise ones stood in a line watching. 6 tall women with their heads wrapped in dark shawls. The people of So Harbor might be about as welcoming to Aiel as the people of Malden would have been, but Perrin had not been sure the wise ones would let Aja's sister come alone. They had been the last reason for waiting. The sun was a red gold rim in the treetops. The sooner there, the sooner back, he said, climbing into the bay saddle. As he rode through the gap that had been made to let the carts out, 2 riversmen were already beginning to replace the missing stakes. No one lacked for wariness with the seamless people nearby. It was 100 paces to the tree line, but his eye caught movement, someone on a horse slipping away into the deeper shadows beneath the towering trees. One of Massima's watchers, no doubt, racing to tell the prophet that Perrin and Verlaine had left the camp. No matter how fast he rode, though, he could not be in time. If Massima wanted Verlaine or Perrin dead, as it seemed likely, he would have to wait on another opportunity. Galen was not about to take any chances, though. No one had seen hide nor toenails of Santes or Gendar, Verlaine's two thief catchers, since the day they failed to return from Massima's camp. And to Galen, that was as sure a message as their heads in a sack. Yet his lancers spread in a shot-wide ring around Verlaine before they reached the trees. And around Perrin, too, but that was only incidental. Given his wishes, Galen would have brought all 900 or so of his winged guards, or better yet, in his view, got Verlaine out of Belgium. Perrin had tried that as well, with no better luck. The woman had a way of listening, then doing exactly as she wished. Bayou was like that, too. Sometimes a man just had to live with it. Most of the time, since there was nothing else to do. The huge trees and stone outcrops sticking out of the snow broke up the formation, of course, but it was still a colorful sight, even in the dim light of the forest. Red streamers floating on light airs and slanted beams of sunlight, red-armored riders vanishing momentarily behind massive oaks and leather leaves. The three Aes Sedai rode behind Perrin and Verlaine, followed by their warders, all watching the woods around them, and the man with Verlaine's banner. Geraint, the banner of Gildan, came a little behind, his men dressed in neat, shifting lines, or as near as they could manage. The forest's openness was a deception. It was suited to neat lines and bright banners, but add in embroidered silks and gems in the crown and warders in those color-shifting cloaks, and it was a most impressive sight. Perrin could have laughed, though without much mirth. Verlaine seemed to sense his thoughts. "When you go to buy a sack of flour," she said, "wear plain wool so the seller thinks you can't afford to pay any more than you must. When you're after flour by the wagon load, wear jewels so she thinks you can afford to come back for all she can lay hands on." Perrin snorted a laugh in spite of himself. It sounded very much like something Master Luhan had told him once, the nudge in the ribs to say it was a joke, and the look in his eye that said it was a little more. Dress poor when you want a small favor, and fine when you want a large one. He was very glad Verlaine no longer smelled like a hunted wolf. At least that took one worry off his mind. They soon caught up to the tail end of the carts, a line that was no longer moving by the time they reached the traveling ground. Axe work and sweat had removed the trees sheared off by gateways and made a little clearing, but it was crowded even before Galen spread his ring of lancers around it facing outward. Bajan Neal, who was there already, a foppish Mirandian with his mustache waxed to points on the dapple gelding. His coat would do for anyone who had not seen an Ashaman before. The only other one he had was black as well, and at least he had no collar pins to mark him out. The snow was not deep, but the 22 Rivers men led by Will Alcine were on their horses too, rather than standing and waiting for their feet to freeze in their boots. They looked a harder lot than the fellows who had left the 2 Rivers with him, longbows slung across their backs, bristling quivers and swords of various descriptions at their belts. Perrin hoped he could send them home soon, or better, take them home. Most were balancing a pole-arm over their saddles. Todd Alcar, Glenn Barsteer, carried banners, Perrin's own Red Wolf Head and Red Eagle of Manethra. Todd's heavy jaw was set stubbornly and flat. A tall, skinny fellow from up to Watch Hill looked sullen. Likely he had not wanted the job. Maybe Todd had not either. Will gave Perrin one of those open, innocent looks that fooled so many girls back home. Will liked too much embroidery on his coat at feast days, and he really loved riding ahead of those banners, probably in the hope some woman would think they were his, but Perrin let it pass. He had not expected the other 3 people in the clearing any more than he had the banners. Holding his cloak around him as if the mild breeze were a gale, Baldur clumsily heeled his blunt-nosed roan forward to meet Perrin. 2 of Fail's hangers-on trailed after him with defiant expressions. Midori's blue eyes looked odd in her dark pirate face, but then her coat, with its puffy green-striped sleeves, looked odd on her bosomy frame. The daughter of a High Lord, she was every inch a noblewoman, and men's clothing just did not suit her. Latian, Karianan, and pale in a coat almost as dark as Niall's, though marked with 4 slashes of red and blue across the chest, was not much taller than she, and the way he sniffled with the cold and rubbed at his sharp nose made him look much less confident. Neither wore a sword, another surprise. "My lord," "Milady first," Bulwer said in a dry voice, ducking a bow in his saddle, a sparrow bobbing on a branch. His eyes flickered toward the Aes Sedai behind him, but that was the only sign he gave that he was aware of the sisters. "My lord, I recalled that I have an acquaintance in this So Harbor, a cutler who travels with his wares, but he may be at home, and I've not seen him in several years." This was the first time he had ever mentioned having a friend anywhere, and a town buried in the north of Altara seemed a peculiar place for it, but Baron nodded. He suspected there was more to this friend than Bulwer was letting on. He was beginning to suspect there was more to Bulwer than the man let on. "And your companions, Master Bulwer?" Berline's face had stayed smooth inside her fur-lined cowl, but she smelled amused. She knew very well that Fail had used her young followers as spies, and was sure that Perrin made the same use of them. "They wanted an outing, my lady first," the bony little man replied blandly. "I will vouch for them, my lord. They've promised to cause no trouble, and they may learn something." He smelled amused, too. A musty smell, of course, coming from him, though with a touch of irritation. Bulwer knew she knew, which did not please him, but she never made open reference to the fact which did. There was definitely more to Bulwer than he let on. The man must have his reasons for taking them along. He had managed to take up all of Fael's young followers one way and another, and had them eavesdropping and watching among the Gildan and Mayenners and even the Aiel. According to him, what your friends said and did could be as interesting as what your enemies planned. And that was when you were sure they were your friends. Of course, Verlaine knew that her people were being spied on, and Bulwer knew she knew that too. And she knew that he... It was all too sophisticated for a country blacksmith. "We're wasting time," Baron said. "Open the gateway, Niall." The Asherman grinned at him and stroked his waxed mustaches. Niall grinned too much since the Shido were found. Maybe he was eager to come to grips with them. He grinned and gestured grandly with one hand. "As you command," he said in a cheerful voice, and a familiar silvery slash of light appeared, widening into a hole in the air. Without waiting for anyone else, Perrin rode through into a snow-covered field surrounded by a low stone wall of rolling country that seemed almost treeless compared to the forest he had left behind. Just a few miles from So Harbor, unless Niall had made a substantial error. If he had, Perrin thought he might pull those cool mustaches right off the man's face. How could the fellow be cheerful? Soon, though, he was riding west beneath the great cloudy sky, along a snowy road, with the high-wheeled carts trundling along in a line after him, early morning shadows stretching ahead. Stayer tugged at the reins, wanting to run, but Perrin held him to a steady walk, no faster than the cart horses could manage. Garland's Mayenners had to cross fields beside the road to maintain their ring around him and Verlaine, and that meant getting past the low walls of rough stone that divided field from field. Some had gates from one farmer's property to the next, probably to allow sharing plow teams. Others they jumped flamboyantly, streamers and their lances flying, risking their animals' legs and their necks. Perrin cared the less about their necks, in truth. Will and the two fools carrying the Wolfhead and the Red Eagle joined the Mayenner bannermen behind the Aes Sedai warders. The other two rivers men strung themselves out flanking the line of carts. There were far too many carts for fewer than 20 men to guard, yet the cart drivers would feel easier seeing them. Not that anyone expected brigands, or Shido for that matter, but no one felt comfortable outside the protection of the camp. In any case, here they would be able to see any threat well before it reached them. The low rolling hills did not really allow a very long view, but it was farm country, with sturdy thatch-roofed stone houses and barns scattered among the fields, and nothing of wildness about it anywhere. Even most of the small thickets clinging to the slopes were accomplished for firewood. But it struck Perrin suddenly that the snow on the road ahead of him was no thresh, yet the only tracks were those made by Galen's foreriders. No one moved around any of those dark houses and barns. No smoke rose from any of the thick chimneys. The countryside seemed absolutely still, absolutely empty. The hair on the back of his neck stirred, trying to stand. An exclamation from one of the Aes Sedai made him look over his shoulder, and he followed Missouri's pointing finger north to a shaped line through the air. It might have been taken for a large bat at first glance, sweeping eastward on long-ribbed wings, a strange bat with a long neck and a long, thin tail trailing behind. Galen barked an oath and pressed his looking-glass to his eye. Perrin could see it well enough unaided, even make out the figure of a human being clinging to the creature's back, riding it like a horse. Sean Chen, Verlaine breathed. both her voice and the smell of her worry. Perrin twisted in the saddle to watch the thing's flight until the glare of the sunrise made him turn away. Nothing to do with us, he said. If Niall had made a mistake, he would strangle the man. Chapter 26. In So Harbor. As it happened, Niall, who had had to remain to hold the gateway open until Girayan and the Gildanan was through, had placed the hole in the air very close to where he aimed. He and Girayan caught up at a gallop just as Perrin topped the rise and drew rein with the town of So Harbor in front of him, on the other side of a small river, crossed by a pair of arching timber bridges. Perrin was no soldier, but he knew right away why Messima had left this place alone. Hard against the river, the town had two massive stone walls dotted with towers around it, the inner rising taller than the outer. A pair of barges were tied to a long wharf that ran along the river wall from bridge to bridge. Yet the wide bridge gates, iron-strapped and closed tight, seemed to be the only openings in that expanse of rough gray stone. Battlements topped the whole length of it. Built to hold off greedy neighboring nobles, So Harbor would have had little fear for Prophet's rabble, even if they came by thousands. Anyone wanting to break into this town would need siege engines and patience, and Messima was more comfortable terrorizing villages and towns without walls or defenses. Well, it's glad I am to see people on the walls over there, Niall said. I was beginning to think everyone in this country was dead and buried. He sounded only half joking, and his grin was forced. As long as they're alive enough to sell grain, Girayan murmured in his nasal, bored voice. Unbuckling his silvery white-plumed helmet, he lifted it down to the tall pommel of the saddle. His eyes swept past Perrin and paused briefly on Berylane before he twisted around to address the Aes Sedai in the same weary tone. Are we going to sit here or go down? Berylane arched an eyebrow at him, a dangerous look, as a man with any brains would see. Girayan did not see. Perrin's hackles were still trying to stand, and more so since seeing the town. Maybe it was just the part of him that was wolf, disliking walls, but he did not think so. The people atop the walls pointed toward them. Some held looking glasses. Those at least would be able to make out the banners clearly. Everyone would be able to see the soldiers, with the streamers on their lances floating in a morning breeze. The first few carts of the line that stretched down the road out of their sight. Maybe everyone from the farms was crowded into the town. We didn't come here to sit, he said. Berylane and Nora between them had laid out how to approach So Harbor. The local lord or lady had surely heard of Shider depredations not many miles to the north of them. They might have heard of the Prophet's presence in Altara, too. Either thing was enough to make anyone wary. Together, they might be enough to make people lose arrows and wait till after to ask who they had shot. In any case, it was highly unlikely they would welcome outland soldiers through their gates at the moment. The lancers remained spread along the rise, to show that these visitors possessed some armed might, even if they chose not to employ it. Not so that So Harbor would be overly impressed by 100 men, but the burnished armor of the Gildanan, the red armor of the winged guards, said the visitors were not wandering tricksters. The Two Rivers men would impress no one until they used their bows, so they remained back with the carts, to hold up the cart driver's spirits. It was all an elaborate bit of nonsense, fluff and feathers, but Perrin was a country blacksmith no matter who called him lord. The first of Mayen and an Aes Sedai should know what they were about in a thing like this.
Hey,
Galen led
Shosh,
the way
how you
down to the river
doing?
at a slow walk, his
Hope you're
right
doing
crimson
good.
helmet resting on his saddle, his back straight. Perrin and Berylane rode a little way behind, with Seonid between them, Suri and Anura at either side. The Aes Sedai with their hoods thrown back, so anyone on those walls who could recognize an Aes Sedai face would have the opportunity to see three. Aes Sedai were welcome in most places, even though people really would rather not. At their backs came all four bannermen, with the warders spaced among them in their eye-wrenching cloaks. And Girayan, with his shining helmet balanced on his thigh, sour-mouthed at being relegated to riding with the warders, and now and then glaring coldly down his nose at Balwar, who trailed at the rear of his two companions. No one had told Balwar he could come, yet no one had said he could not. He bobbed a bow whenever the nobleman looked at him, then went back to studying the town walls ahead. Perrin could not shake his uneasiness as they drew nearer the town. The horses' hooves clattered hollowly on the southernmost bridge, a wide structure that rose high enough above the swift-flowing river to let a barge like those tied to the wharf pass easily underneath on sweeps. Neither of the broad, bluff-bowed craft had any provision for stepping a mast. One of those barges had settled deep in the water, slanting against taut mooring ropes, and the other somehow looked abandoned too. A rank sour smell in the air made him rub at his nose. No one else seemed to notice. Near the foot of the bridge, Galen drew up. The closed gates, covered with black iron straps a foot wide, would have forced a pause anyway. "We have heard of the troubles plaguing this land," he bellowed at the man atop the wall, managing formality at the top of his lungs. "But we are merely passing through, and we come for trade, not trouble, to buy grain and other needful things, not to fight. I have the honor to announce Verlaine Sir Payan Drag Peyron, first of Mayenne, blessed of the light, defender of the waves, high seed of House Peyron, come to speak with the Lord or Lady of this land. I have the honor to announce Perrin to Bashir Barra."
Yeah,
Lord of the Two
that'd
Rivers.
be exhausting, all right.
Several other titles that Perrin had no more right to, and had never heard before. They went on for the Aes Sedai, giving each the full honorific, and adding her Aja as well. It was a very impressive assignment. When he fell silent, there was silence. In the crenellations above, dirty-faced men exchanged bleak looks and fierce whispers, shifting crossbows and polearms nervously. Only a few wore helmets, or any sort of armor. Most were in rough coats. But on one man, Perrin thought he saw what might have been silk under a layer of grime. It was hard to tell with so much caked with dirt. Even his ears could not make out what they were saying. "How do we know you're alive?" a hoarse voice shouted down at last. Verlaine blinked in surprise, but no one laughed. It was cool talk. Yet Perrin thought the hair on the back of his neck really was standing still. Something was very wrong here. The Aes Sedai seemed not to sense it. Then again, Aes Sedai could hide anything behind those smooth masks of cool serenity. The beads in Anora's thin braids clicked faintly as she shook her head. Masuri ran an icy gaze along the men on the wall. "If I must prove I am alive, you will regret it," Siona denounced loudly in crisp Arian accents, a little more heated than her face suggested. "If you continue to point that crossbow at me, you will regret it even more." Several of the men hastily raised their crossbows to point at the sky. Not all, though. More whispers rustled along the top of the wall, but someone must have recognized Aes Sedai. At last, the gates squealed open on massive rusty hinges. A gagging stench swept out the town. The stink Perrin had been smelling, only stronger. Old dirt and old sweat, decaying middens of chamber pots too long and empty. Perrin's ears tried to lie back. Galen half lifted his red helmet as if to replace it on his head before urging us down through the gates. Perrin booted Stayer to follow, easing his axe in its belt loop. Just inside the gate, a filthy man in a torn coat poked Perrin's leg with a finger, then darted back when Stayer snapped at him. The fellow had been fat once, but his coat sagged and his skin hung loose. "Just wanted to be sure," he muttered, scratching his side absently. "My lord," he added articulately. His eyes seemed to focus on Perrin's face for the first time. His scratching fingers froze. Golden yellow eyes were not a common sight, after all. "Do you see many dead men walking?" Perrin asked quietly, trying to make a joke of it as he patted Day's neck. A trained warhorse wanted to be rewarded for protecting his rider. The fellow flinched as if the horse had bared his teeth at him again. His mouth twitched into a rictus smile. He edged sideways until he bumped solidly into Verlaine's mare. Galen was right behind her, still looking ready to don his helmet, his one eye trying to watch 6 ways at once. "Where can I find your lord or lady?" she demanded impatiently. Mayenne was a small nation, but Verlaine was unaccustomed to being ignored. "Everyone else seems to have gone mute, but I heard you use your tongue." "Well, man, speak up." The fellow stared up at her, licking his lips. Lord Cowan is away, my lady." His eyes darted toward Perrin, then flickered away. "The grain merchants, they're who you want. They can always be found at the Golden Barge. That way."
That's killing me today.
He thrust out a hand, pointing vaguely deeper into the town, then suddenly scrambled away, looking back over his shoulder at them as though fearful of pursuit. "I think we should find somewhere else," Perrin said. That fellow had been afraid of more than yellow eyes. This place felt askew. "We are already here, and there is nowhere else," Verlaine replied in a very practical tone. In all that stink, he could not catch her scent. He would have to go by what he heard and saw, and her face was common enough for an Aes Sedai. I've been in towns that smelled worse than this band. I'm sure I have. And if this Lord Callan is gone, it won't be the first time I've dealt with merchants. You don't really believe they've seen the dead walking, do you? What was a man to say to that without sounding a pure wolfman? In any case, the others were already crowding through the gates. They're not in any need of rain now. Winter and a hard field sounded like mismatched guard dogs, the one fair, the other dark. Both ready to rip out throats at the blink of an eye. They certainly had the feel of So Harbor. Kirkland, riding beside Missouri, looked unwilling to wait for the eye to blink. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Urayan had a hand to his nose, and a glare in his eye that said someone was going to pay for making him smell this. A Dorian Latian looked ill too, but Bulwer merely peered about, tilting his head, then drew the pair of them off into a narrow side street leading north. As Verlaine said, they were there already. The colorful banners looked decidedly out of place as Perrin rode through the cramped, winding streets of the town. Some of the streets were actually quite wide for the size of So Harbor, but they felt close, as if the stone buildings on either side somehow loomed higher than their 2 or 3 stories, and were about to topple on his head to boot. Imagination made the streets seem dim, too. It had to be imagination. The sky was not that gray. People filled the dirty stone paving, but not enough to account for all the farms in the area being abandoned, and everyone scurried, heads down, not hurrying towards something, hurrying away. No one looked at anyone else. With the river practically on their doorsteps, they had forgotten how to wash, too. He did not see a face without a coating of grime, or a garment that did not look to have been worn for a week. Hard work in muck with it. The stink only worsened the deeper into the town they rode. They could get used to anything in time. Worst of all was the quiet. Villages were quiet sometimes, if not so still as the woods, but a town always had a faint murmur, the sound of shopkeepers bargaining and people going about their lives. So Harbor did not even whisper. It barely seemed to breathe. Getting better directions was difficult, since most people darted away if spoken to. Eventually, they dismounted in front of the prosperous-appearing inn. 3 stories of neatly dressed gray stone under a slate roof, with a sign hanging out front announcing the Golden Barge. The sign even had a touch of gilt in the lettering, and on the grain mounted high in the barge, and uncovered as it never would be for shipping. No grooms appeared from the stable yard beside the inn, so the bannerman had to serve as
Hey,
hostholders.
cheers, fire.
That did not make them happy. Todd put so much attention into peering at the flow of dirty people that scurried by and fondling the hilt of his short sword that Sayer very nearly got a couple of his fingers when he took the stallion's reins. The Mayenne and the Gildanon seemed to be wishing they had lances rather than banners. Bland just looked wild-eyed. In spite of the morning sun, the light did seem shadowy. Going inside did not make things any better. At first glance, the common room bore the inn's prosperity, with polished round tables and proper chairs instead of benches, standing beneath a high, stout-beamed ceiling. The walls were painted with fields of barley and oats and millet, ripening under a bright sun. A colorfully painted clock stood on the carved mantel above a wide fireplace of white stone. The fireplace was cold, though, the air nearly as icy as outside. The clock had run down and the polish dulled. Dust lay on everything. The only people in the room were 6 men and 5 women, huddling over their drinks around an oval table, larger than the rest, that stood in the middle of the floor. One of the men leaped to his feet with an oath, face paling underneath the dirt, when Perrin and the others entered. A plump woman with lank, greasy hair shoved her pewter cup to her mouth and tried to gulp so fast that wine spilled over her chin. Maybe it was his eyes. Maybe. "What happened in this town?" Nora said firmly, tossing back her cloak as though a fire blazed on the hearth. The calm gaze she ran across the people at the table froze every one of them. Abruptly, Perrin realized that neither Missouri nor Sionnet had followed him inside. He doubted very much that they were waiting in the streets with horses. What they and their warders were doing was any man's guess. The man who had jumped up tugged at his coat collar with a finger. The coat had been fine blue wool once, a row of gilded buttons to his neck. But he appeared to have been spilling food down the front of it for some time, maybe more than had gone into it. He was another whose skin hung slack. "That happened, said I," he stammered. "Be quiet, Michael," a haggard woman said quickly. Her dark dress was embroidered on the high neck and the long sleeves, but dirt made the colors uncertain. Her eyes were sunk in pits. "What makes you think something happened, said I?" Anura would have continued, but Verlaine stepped in as the Aes Sedai opened her mouth again. "We are looking for the grain merchants." Anura's expression never changed, but her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Long looks passed between the people around the table. The haggard woman studied Anura for a moment, quickly passing on to Verlaine and obviously taking in the silks and fire drops, and the dye of it. She spread her skirts in a curtsy. "We are the Merchants' Guild of So Harbor, my lady. What's left of..." Breaking off, she took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am Rahim of Anna, my lady. How may we serve you?" The merchants seemed to brighten a little on learning that their visitors had come for grain and other things that they could supply, oil for lamps and cooking, beans and needles and horseshoe nails, cloth and candles, and a dozen things more that the camp needed. At least they grew a little less fearful. Any ordinary merchant, hearing the list Verlaine gave, would have been hard-pressed not to smile greedily. This thought. Mistress Harnan shouted for the innkeeper to bring wine. "The best wine! Quickly now! Quickly!" But when a long-nosed woman stuck her head hesitantly into the common room, Mistress Harnan had to rush over and catch her soiled sleeve to keep it from vanishing again. The fellow in the food-stained coat called for someone named Sparrow to bring the sample jars, but after shouting 3 times with no response, he gave a nervous laugh and darted into a back room to return a moment later, his arms around 3 large cylindrical wooden containers. He sat on the table, still laughing nervously. The others wore a collection of twitching smiles as they bowed and curtsied Verlaine to a seat at the head of the oval table, greasy-faced men and women scratching at themselves without appearing to notice what they were doing. Aaron tucked his gauntlets behind his belt and stood against a painted wall, watching. They had agreed to leave the bargaining to Verlaine. She was willing to admit, reluctantly, that he knew more horseflesh than she, but she had negotiated treaties covering the sale of years' worth of the oilfish harvest. Anura had smiled thinly at the suggestion that a jumped-up country lad might take a hand. She did not call him that. She could milord him as smoothly as Masuri Arseonid. Yet it was clear she thought some things clearly above his ability. She was not smiling now, standing behind Verlaine and studying the merchants, as if to memorize their faces. The innkeeper brought wine, in pewter cups that had last seen a polishing cloth weeks ago, if not months, but Aaron only peered into his, and swirled it in the cup. Mistress Badia, the innkeeper, had dirt under her fingernails, embedded in her knuckles like part of her skin. He noticed that Galan, standing with his back to the opposite wall, one hand on his sword hilt, only held his cup too. Verlaine never touched hers. Urayan sniffed at his, then drank deeply and called for Mistress Badia to bring him a pitcher. "Thin stuff, to be called your best," he told the woman through his nose, looking down at it. "But it might wash away the stink." She stared at him blankly, then fetched a tall pewter pitcher to his table without saying a word. Urayan apparently took her silence for respect. Master Crossan, the fellow in the food-stained coat, unscrewed the tops of the wooden containers and spilled out hulled samples of the grain they had to offer in piles on the table. Yellow millet and brown oats, the barley only a little darker brown. There would have been no rain before the harvest. "The finest quality, as you can see," he said. "Yes, the finest." The smile slid off Mistress Arnim's face, and she jerked it back. "We sell only the finest." For people touting their wares as the finest, they did not seem to bargain very hard. Aaron had watched men and women back home selling the wool clip and the tobacco to merchants down from Berla. They always disparaged the buyers' offers, sometimes complaining the merchants were trying to beggar them when the price was twice what it had been the year before, or even suggesting they might wait till next year to sell it all. It was a dance as intricate as any other feast day. "I suppose we might lower the price further for such a large quantity," a balding man told Verlaine, scratching at his gray-streaked beard. It was cut short, and greasy enough to cling close to his chin. Aaron wanted to scratch his own beard just watching the fellow. "It's been a hard winter," a round-faced woman muttered. Only 2 of the other merchants bothered to frown at her. Aaron set his wine cup down on a nearby table and walked over to the gathering in the middle of the room. Nura gave him one sharp, warning glance, but several of the merchants looked at him curiously and cautiously. Galen had made his introductions all over again, but these folk were not entirely clear where Mayen was exactly, or how powerful. And 2 Rivers only meant good tobacco to them. 2 Rivers tobacco was known everywhere. If not for the presence of an Aes Sedai, his eyes might have set them running. Everyone fell silent as Aaron scooped up a handful of millet, the tiny spheres smooth and vivid yellow on his palm. This grain was the first clean thing he had seen in the town. Letting the grain spill back onto the table, he picked up the lid of one of the containers. The threads cut into the wood were sharpened and worn. The lid would fit tightly. Mistress Arnon's eyes slid away from his, and she licked her lips. "I want to see the grain in the warehouses," he said. Half the people around the table twitched. Mistress Arnon drew herself up, blustering. "We don't sell what we don't have. You can watch our laborers load every sack on your carts if you wish to spend hours in the cold." "I was about to suggest a visit to a warehouse," Verlaine put in. Rising, she drew her red gloves from behind her belt and began tugging them on. "I would never buy grain without seeing the warehouse." Mistress Arnon sagged. The bald-headed man put his head down on the table. No one said anything, though. The dispirited merchants did not bother to fetch their cloaks before leading them into the street. The breeze had picked up to a wind, cold as only a late winter wind could be, when people were already thinking ahead to spring, but they did not seem to notice. The hunch of their shoulders had nothing to do with cold. "Can we go now, Lord Parent?" Glenn asked anxiously when Ben and the others appeared. "This place makes me want a bath." Manura gave him a frown in passing that made him flinch like one of the merchants. Glenn tried a placating smile at her, but it was a sickly effort, too late for anything but her back. "As soon as I can arrange it," Parent said. The merchants were already scurrying down the street, heads down, not looking at anyone. Verlaine and Anura managed to follow without appearing to rush, gliding along, one as composed as the other, two fine ladies out for a stroll, and never mind the filth underfoot, or the stink in the air, or the dirty people who started at the sight of them and sometimes all but ran away as fast as they could. Verlaine had finally donned his helmet, openly held his sword hilt with both hands, ready to draw. Urayan was carrying his helmet on his hip, his other hand occupied with his wine cup. Contemptuously eyeing the grimy-faced folk who hurried by, he sniffed at the wine as if it were a pomander to fight off the stench of the town. The warehouses were located on a stone-paved street, barely wider than a wagon, between the town's two walls. The smell was better there, close to the river, but the wind-blown street was empty except for Perrin and the others. There was not even a stray dog to be seen. Dogs disappeared when the town grew hungry. Why would a town with enough grain to sell be hungry? Perrin pointed to a two-story warehouse chosen at random, no different from any other, a windowless stone building with a wide pair of wooden doors held shut by a wooden bar that could have done for a sewing beam with a golden barge. The merchants suddenly recalled that they had forgotten to bring men to lift the bars. They offered to go back for them. Lady Verlaine and Anura Sedai could rest in front of the fire at the golden barge while workmen were fetched. They were sure Mistress Vidir would lay a fire. Their tongues went still when Perrin placed his hand beneath the thick beam and shoved it up out of the wooden brackets. The thing was heavy, but he backed up with it to get him room to turn and toss it down the street with a crash. The merchants stared. This might have been the first time they had ever seen a man in a silk coat do anything that could be called work. Urayan rolled his eyes and took another sniff at his wine. "Lanterns," Mistress Arnon said weakly. "We'll need lanterns or torches if—" A ball of light appeared floating above Anura's hand, glowing bright enough in the gray morning to cast everyone in faint shadows in the paving and stone walls. Some of the merchants put hands up to shield their eyes. After a moment, Master Clausen tugged one of the doors open by an iron ring. The smell inside was the familiar sharp-scented barley, almost strong enough to overcome the stench of the town. And something more. Small, dim shapes slunk away into the shadows ahead of Anura's light. He could have seen better without it, or at least deeper into the darkness. The glowing ball cast a large pool of light, walled off what lay beyond. He smelled cat, closer to feral than not. And rat, too. A sudden squeal in the black depths of the warehouse, suddenly cut off, spoke of cat eating rat. There were always rats in grain barns, and cats to hunt them. It was company. Normal. Almost enough to soothe his uneasiness. Almost. He smelled something else. A smell he should know. A fierce yowl deep in the warehouse turned to rising cries of pain that died abruptly. Apparently, the rats that so hover sometimes hunted back. Perrin's hackles stirred again, but surely there was nothing here the Dark One would want to spy on. Most rats were just rats. There was no need to go very far in. Four sacks filled the darkness, high, slant-sided stacks on low wooden platforms to keep the stacks off the stone floor. Rows and rows of stacks piled nearly to the ceiling, and likely the same on the floor above. If not, this building still held enough grain to feed his people for weeks. Walking to the nearest stack, he drove his belt knife into a pale brown sack and sliced down through the tough jute fibers.
One more dab and
Let
then
a
we'll
barley
smoke a
cone
joint.
stir around, and, clear in the glow of Anora's brilliant light, wriggling black specks. Weevils, almost as many as there were barley corns. Their scent was sharper than that of the barley. Weevils. He wished the hair on his neck would stop trying to rise. The cold should have been enough to kill weevils. That one sack was proof, and his nose knew the smell of weevils now, but he moved to another stack, then another and another, each time slicing open one sack. Each released a spill of pale brown barley and black weevils. The merchants were standing huddled together in the doorway, daylight behind them. Nora's light cast their faces in sharp relief. Worried faces. Despairing faces. "We would be most happy to winnow each sack we sell," Mistress Arnott said unsteadily, "for only a slight additional, for half the last price I offered." Fairlane cut in sharply. Wrinkling her nose in disgust, she moved her skirts clear of the weevils scuttling among the grain on the floor. "You will never get all of them." "And no millet," Aaron said grimly. His men needed food, and so did the soldiers, but millet grains were hardly bigger than the weevils. Winnow as they would, she would bring back weevils and millet in equal weight. "We'll take extra beans instead, but they get winnowed too." Suddenly someone shrieked outside in the street. Not a cat or a rat, but a man in terror. Aaron did not even realize he had drawn his axe until he found the haft in his hand as he pushed through the merchants in the doorway. They huddled closer together, licking their lips, and not even trying to see who had screamed. Urayan was backed up against the wall of a warehouse across the way, his shining helmet with the white plume lying on the pavement beside his wine cup. The man's sword was half out of the scabbard, but he seemed frozen, staring with bulging eyes at the wall of the building Aaron had just come out of. Aaron touched his arm and he jumped. "There was a man," the Gildan said uncertainly. "He was just there. He looked at me and—" Urayan scrubbed a hand over his face. Despite the cold, sweat glistened on his forehead. "He walked through the wall. He did. You must believe me." Someone moaned. One of the merchants, Aaron thought. "I saw the man too," Seonet said behind him, and it was his turn to give a start. His nose was useless in this place. Giving the wall Urayan had indicated a last glance, the Aes Sedai stepped away from it with a palpable unwillingness. Her warders were tall men, towering over her, but they stayed only far enough away to gain room to draw their swords. Though what the grim-eyed warders were to fight if Seonet was serious, Aaron could not imagine. "I find it difficult to lie, Lord Aaron," Seonet said dryly when he expressed doubt. But her tone quickly became as serious as her face, and her eyes were so intent that they alone began to make Aaron feel uneasy. "The dead are walking in So Harbor. Lord Howland fled the town for fear of his wife's spirit. It seems there was doubt as to how she died. Hardly a man or woman in the town has not seen someone dead, and a good many have seen more than one. Some say people have died from the touch of someone dead. I cannot verify that, but people have died of fright and others because of it. No one goes out at night in So Harbor or walks into a room unannounced. People strike out at shadows and surprises with whatever is to hand, and sometimes they have found a husband, wife, or a neighbor dead at their feet. This is not hysteria or a tale to frighten children, Lord Aaron. I have never heard of the like, but it is real. You must leave one of us here to do what we can." Aaron shook his head slowly. He could not afford to lose an Aes Sedai if he was to free Fael. Mistress Arnott began to weep even before he said, "So Harbor will have to face its dead alone." But fear of the dead only explained so much. Maybe people were too frightened to think of washing, but it seemed unlikely that fear would take everyone that way. They just did not seem to care anymore. And the weevils, thriving in winter, in freezing cold. There was worse wrong in So Harbor than spirits walking. Every instinct told him to leave at a dead run without looking back. He purely wished that he could. Chapter 27. What Must Be Done. The winnowing took place on a snowy eastern riverbank, where there was nothing to cut the sharp north wind. Men and women from the town hauled sacks across the bridges in 4-horse wagons and 1-horse carts, even barrows pushed by hand. Normally, buyers brought their own wagons to the warehouses, where at worst the grain and dried beans only had to be carried as far as the wharf, but Barron had no intention of sending his cart drivers into So Harbor. Or anyone else, for that matter. Whatever was wrong in that town might be catching. Anyway, the drivers were uneasy enough as it was, frowning at the dirty townsfolk, people who never spoke but laughed nervously when they accidentally met someone's eye. The grimy-faced merchants overseeing the work were no better. In the driver's native Kyrian, merchants were clean, respectable people, at least outwardly, who very seldom twitched just because someone moved at the corner of their vision. Between merchants with a tendency to peer suspiciously at anyone they did not know, and townsfolk who dragged their feet recrossing the bridges, clearly reluctant to go back inside their own walls, the cart drivers were right on edge. They gathered in little clusters, pale, dark-clad men and women, gripping the hilts of their belt knives and peering at the taller locals as if at murderous madmen. Perrin rode about slowly, watching the winnowing, examining the row of carts that stretched up the rise and out of sight waiting to be loaded, or the town's wagons and carts and barrows rolling across the bridges. He made sure he was in plain view. He was not sure why the sight of him pretending to be unconcerned should settle anyone else's nerves, yet it seemed to. Enough that no one started running, at least, though they continued to look askance at the people of So Harbor. They kept their distance, too, and just as well. Let the notion that some of those folks might not be alive get into the Kyrianans' heads, and half would whip up their cart horses to flee then and there. Most of the rest might not wait much past dark. That sort of tale could twist anyone's head come night. The one sun, nearly hidden by gray overcast, still sat less than halfway to its noonday peak, yet increasingly it was obvious they would have to be there through the night. Maybe more than one. His jaw knotted with the effort of not grinding his teeth, and even Neil began to avoid his scowls. He did not snap at anyone, he just wanted to. It was an arduous process, the winnowing. Every last sack had to be opened and emptied onto large flat wicker baskets, each of which took 2 people to toss the grain or beans. The cold wind carried away weevils in a shower of black flecks, and men and women with woven 2-handed fans added to the gusts. A swift current swept away everything that was blown into the river, but soon the snow on the riverbank was trampled underfoot, and the gray slush layered with insects dead or dying from the cold, and a liberal coating of oats and barley speckled with red beans. There was always a new layer to replace what feet mashed into the snow. What was left in the baskets seemed cleaner, though, if not entirely clean, when it was poured back into the coarse jute bags, which had been turned inside out and beaten fiercely with sticks by children to shake out vermin. The refilled sacks went into the Kyrianans' carts as soon as the tops were tied, but the piles of empty bags grew at a prodigious rate. He was leaning on the pommel of Stayer's saddle, trying to calculate whether it was taking 2 whole cartloads from the warehouse to fill one of his carts with grain, when Berylane brought her white mare up beside him, holding her scarlet cloak close against the wind with one red-gloved hand. Nura reined in a few paces away, her ageless face smooth and unreadable. The Aes Sedai appeared to be giving them privacy, yet she was close enough to hear anything above whispers, even without any tricks of the power. Smooth face or no, her beak of a nose gave her a predatory look today. Her beaded braids seemed some strange eagle's lowered crest. "You cannot save everyone," Berylane said calmly. Away from the stink of the town, her scent was sharp with urgency and razor-edged with anger. "Sometimes you must choose. So Harbor is Lord Cowland's duty. He had no right to abandon his people." Not angered with him, then. Perrin frowned. Did she think he felt guilty? Balanced against Vail's life, the troubles of So Harbor could not budge the scales a hair. But he turned his bay so he was looking at the gray town walls across the river, not the hollow-eyed children piling up empty sacks. The man did what he could, what he had to. "Does Anura have an opinion on what's happening here?" he growled. Quietly, but somehow he had no doubt the Aes Sedai heard. I've little idea what Honora thinks, Fairlane replied, making no effort to lower her voice. She not only did not care who overheard, she wanted to be heard. She is not as forthcoming as she once was, as I once thought she was. It is up to her to mend what she has torn. Without looking at the Aes Sedai, she turned and rode away. Honora remained behind, eyes unblinking on Perrin's face. You are Taviran, yes, but you are still only a thread in the pattern, as am I. In the end, even the Dragon Reborn is just a thread to be woven into the pattern. Not even a Taviran thread chooses how it will be woven. Those threads are people, Perrin said wearily. Sometimes maybe people don't want to be woven into the pattern without any say. And you think this makes a difference? Not waiting on an answer, she lifted her reins and heeled her fine-ankled brown mare after Berlin in a gallop that fanned her cloak behind her. She was not the only Aes Sedai who wanted words with Perrin. No, he told Sioned firmly after listening to her, patting Stayer's neck. It was the rider who wanted soothing, though. He wanted to be away from So Harbor. I said no, and I mean no. She sat her saddle stiffly, a pale little woman carved of ice, except that her eyes were dark coals burning, and she reeked of affronted fury barely in check. Sioned was mild as milk water with the wise ones, but he was not a wise one. Behind her, Alhara's dark face was a stone, gray streaking his curly black hair like frost. Winter's face was red above his curled mustaches. They had to accept what passed between their Aes Sedai and the wise ones, but Perrin was not. The wind whipped their water cloaks about, leaving their hands free for swords if need be. Rippling in the wind, cloaks shifted in shades of gray and brown, blue and white. It was easier on the stomach than seeing them make parts of a man disappear. Some easier. If I have to, I'll send a Dar to bring you back, he warned. Her face stayed cold, her eyes hot, but a quiver ran through her, swaying the small white gem hanging on her forehead. Not from fear of what the wise ones would do to her if she had to be brought back, just from the same offensive parent that made her scent a hooked thorn. He was growing accustomed to defending Aes Sedai. Not a habit a wise man got into, but there seemed no way out of it. What about you? He asked Missouri. Do you want to stay in So Harbor as well? The slim woman was known for speaking straight to the point, direct as a green for all she was brown. But she said calmly, would you not send Adara after me too? There are many ways to serve, and we cannot always pick the ways we would wish. Which, come to think, might be the point in a way. He still had no idea why she visited Massima in secret. Did she suspect that he knew? Missouri's face was a bland mask. Kirkland wore a bored expression. Now they were out of So Harbor. He managed to seem slumped while sitting his horse erect, without a worry in the world or a thought in his head. A man who believed that of Kirkland would return the next day to buy a second pig in a poke. The townsfolk worked mechanically as the sun rose higher, like people who wanted to lose themselves in the task at hand, and feared the return of memories when they stopped. Perrin decided So Harbor was making him fanciful. Still, he thought he was right. The air beyond the walls still looked too dim, as though a shading cloud hung over the town. At noon, the cart drivers cleared patches of snow on the slope rising from the river to make small fires and brew weak tea with leaves brewing their third pot, or maybe fourth. There had been no tea to be had in the town. Some of the drivers looked at the bridges as if thinking to enter So Harbor and see what they could find to eat. A glance at the dirt-caked people working the winnowing baskets sent them back to dig out their small bags of oatmeal and ground acorn. At least they knew that mix was clean. A few eyed the sacks already loaded on the carts, but the beans needed to be soaked and the grain run through the large hand mills that had been left back in the camp, and that was after the cooks picked out as many more weevils as they thought men could not stomach eating. Perrin had no appetite, not for the cleanest bread. But he was drinking what passed for tea from a battered tin cup when Lation found him. The Karianan did not actually come to him. Instead, the short man in the striped dark coat rode slowly past the small fire where Perrin was standing and reined in with a frown a little upslope. Dismounting, Lation lifted his gelding's near forehoof and frowned at it. Of course, He did look up twice to see whether Perrin was coming. With a sigh, Perrin returned the dented cup to the blocky little woman he had borrowed it from, a graying cart driver who spread her dark skirts in a curtsy, and grinned and shook her head at Lation. Likely she could sneak 10 times as well as the fellow. Neil, squatting by the fire with his hands wrapped around another tin cup, laughed out loud so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. Maybe he was beginning to go crazy. Light at this place gave a man cheerful thoughts. Lation straightened long enough to make
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.